Day 1. I'm going to start recording these things. I've been putting it off for about 6 hours now, which is not like me. I'm usually the guy with the plan, the checklist, the laminated card on the back of the door that tells you in what order to do what. But I sat down at this desk 3 times tonight and just stared at the recorder and didn't hit the button. I think I was hoping I wouldn't need to. I think some part of me still wanted to wake up tomorrow and find out I'd overreacted. That this was going to be like the 2019 thing, or the Outbreak scare in December 2 years ago, where I spent 4 days in the shelter and came up to find the news had already moved on to some congressman's affair. This isn't that. I know what this is. I've known since this morning at 6:14, when I was drinking my first coffee of the day, and pulled up the police scanner app on my phone, the way I do every morning, just background noise while I'm reading. And the traffic on the emergency channels was wrong. Not busy wrong. Not the kind of frantic chatter you get around a bad car accident or a house fire. Wrong in a different way. There were gaps. Long silences that a busy dispatch board shouldn't have. And when someone did come on the radio, their voices had that clipped, effortful quality of a person who is physically holding themselves together. I've been monitoring police and emergency frequencies for about 11 years. I know what normal sounds like. By 7:30, I had my phone on 3 different news streams, 2 local radio stations, and a shortwave feed out of a university repeater station that I've had bookmarked for years, because they're usually about 40 minutes ahead of mainstream reporting on anything regional. The news streams were showing violent attacks in 3 cities. The radio was saying unusual incidents. The shortwave was already using the word clusters. Clusters of infected individuals. That was the phrase. Clusters. I called my supervisor at Radford Electric, left a voicemail. Said I had a family emergency and wouldn't be in. He's going to be annoyed about that because we have a transformer installation scheduled for Thursday that I've been project managing for 3 months. I felt bad about it for maybe 40 seconds. Then I went to the basement. My name is Owen Garrett. I'm 38 years old. I'm a licensed electrical engineer, which means in the regular world I spend most of my time looking at diagrams and arguing with contractors about load calculations, and occasionally getting yelled at by site managers who don't understand why you can't just run a standard circuit through a flood zone. In my other life, the one my coworkers used to joke about, the one that made my ex-wife increasingly uncomfortable over the course of our marriage, I've spent the last 9 years building, stocking, and refining a survival shelter under and around the property I own, about 22 miles outside Harlow, which is a mid-sized city in the mid-Atlantic region that I am deliberately not going to be more specific about, because if anyone finds these recordings, I want there to be at least some uncertainty about where to look. The property is 4 acres. The house is a standard 2-story farmhouse, maybe 100 years old, that I bought for a price that would have seemed low even in 2011, because it needed significant work. I've done most of that work myself over 9 years. The house is real, functional, and looks like a house. That's by design. What's under and around it is something different. I'm going to describe it once, clearly, because it matters for understanding everything that comes after. Primary shelter, a reinforced basement that I expanded laterally under the property over the course of about 3 years, using a mix of professional excavation during the portions I could justify as foundation work on permits, and weekend labor for the parts I did on my own. The total underground space is roughly 1,800 square feet across 3 connected rooms. I've lined the walls with rebar-reinforced poured concrete, and the ceiling with steel I-beams, salvaged from a demolition site where I knew the structural engineer. The shelter has its own ventilation system with HEPA filtration, a hand pump well that draws from a separate water table than the main house system, and 2 entry points, one from the basement of the house, one from a concealed hatch in the barn that sits about 60 feet from the back of the house. Power. 3 things. A propane generator in its own sealed room with exterior venting, a bank of deep cycle batteries charged by 8 solar panels on the barn roof that most people would mistake for an agricultural power system, and a small wind generator on a tower I built to look like a weather monitoring station. I can run essential systems indefinitely on solar and wind. The generator is for peak loads and for when I need to run serious equipment. Water. The hand pump well gives me access to clean groundwater. I have 2,000 gallons in tanks as a static reserve. And I have a proper rainwater collection system on the house and barn roofs that runs through a triple filter setup before it hits the main tank. Food. This is the thing I get the most complicated feelings about. I have, right now, enough stored food to feed one person for approximately 3 years, or 4 people for 9 months. It's a combination of commercially canned goods, freeze-dried meals I ordered through suppliers, that cater to outdoor recreation and prepper communities, dry staples, salt, sugar, oil, and a significant amount of seeds. I also have a small hydroponic setup in one of the shelter rooms that can produce leafy greens and some vegetables under artificial light. It's not a farm, but it's not nothing. Medical, basic field surgery kit, about 14 months of the prescription medication I take for high blood pressure, broad-spectrum antibiotics in quantity, a solid reference library and physical books, and on an encrypted hard drive, and a supply of wound care materials that would make a small urgent care clinic functional for about 6 weeks. Communications. This is where I've put the most of my engineering background. I have a shortwave radio setup that can receive globally and transmit regionally, a VHF, UHF scanner that covers emergency frequencies, a repeater antenna I built on the barn roof that extends my receive range significantly, a collection of handheld Baofeng radios that I've programmed for local public safety frequencies, and a satellite communicator for emergency text transmission. I built most of the antenna infrastructure myself. I know what I'm doing with radio. Security. I'm going to be deliberately vague here too. I have what I need. The property has a perimeter fence that I've reinforced over the years, under cover of livestock protection, even though I've never kept livestock. The fence isn't going to stop a determined human group, but it's a delay, and delay is what you need. I have plans for escalating that if it becomes necessary. That's the setup. That's what 9 years of weekends and a not insignificant portion of my engineering salary built. I activated my emergency protocol at approximately 8:45 this morning. That means, went through my physical and digital inventory checklist, confirmed the status of all stored supplies, started the generator test cycle, switched on the shortwave and scanner to continuous monitoring, secured the house, moved my sleeping area to the basement, locked the barn, pulled the truck, a 2018 Ford F-250, diesel, with a full tank and 2 auxiliary fuel cans, into the barn and closed the doors. I also made 2 phone calls, one to my sister in Portland, which went to voicemail, one to a man named Craig Bellman, who is my closest neighbor, about 2 miles down the road, who I've known for 6 years, and who I have never explicitly told about the shelter, but who I think has suspected something, because one winter I asked to borrow his tractor for what I said was drainage work, and the drainage work took 11 weekends. I left him a message that said, and I'm going to read this exactly from what I wrote down afterward. Craig, this is Owen. Don't go into Harlow today. Don't let your family go in either. If you see anything unusual on the road, people acting wrong, crowd behavior that doesn't make sense, don't engage. Call me. I have some things set up here that might be useful. I didn't say more than that. I didn't know how to say more than that in a way that didn't sound like what it was, which was 9 years of waiting finally paying off in the worst possible way. Craig hasn't called back. Right now it's 11:42 p.m. I've been awake for about 19 hours. I'm going to try to sleep for 4 hours, then I'm back on the radio at 4 a.m., because that's when the shortwave propagation usually gets cleaner, and I can pull in feeds from farther east. What I know right now, sorted by confidence level. High confidence. There are large-scale incidents of mass violence occurring in at least 9 cities based on emergency frequency traffic. The incidents appear to involve infected individuals who are attacking uninfected people. The infected do not appear to be responding normally to pain or injury. Law enforcement response capacity in the affected cities is being overwhelmed. Medium confidence. This started fast, not a slow burn. The gap between unusual reports and systemic breakdown in the radio traffic was about 4 hours this morning. That's faster than disease usually moves. That's faster than almost any scenario I modeled. Low confidence, but tracking. There's something in the frequency of the emergency calls from hospital channels that I don't like. The phrasing around respiratory keeps coming up. I can't tell yet if that's incidental or if it means something. I'll know more by morning. Day 2, 4:15 a.m. Sleep happened. About 3.5 hours. On the cot in the shelter's main room, with the scanner set to wake me on priority traffic. It woke me twice. First time was a county sheriff's channel playing a recorded public alert about avoiding certain roads. Second time was a call I couldn't make full sense of. 2 units, heavy static, something about a perimeter at the high school gymnasium. And then one of the voices stopped in a way that made me not want to think about it too hard. I'm at the shortwave now, 4 a.m. frequencies, clear night, and I'm pulling in something I wasn't expecting. There's a broadcast out of a government emergency station. These are the EAS backbone stations, the ones most people don't know exist, running on reserved frequencies. And it's on a loop. Standard emergency alert language on the surface. But the loop timing is wrong. It's repeating on a 19-minute cycle, which is not standard. Standard EAS loop is 8 minutes. 19 minutes means someone set this up manually, and they set it up in a hurry, without going through the normal configuration. Which means whoever put this broadcast together was doing it fast, probably improvising. That tells me the institutional response is already degraded. You don't improvise emergency broadcasts when you have time to do it right. The content of the broadcast is, stay inside, avoid contact with infected individuals, await further instruction, no specific guidance, no designated shelter points, no information about the nature of infection or spread. That void of information is itself information. They either don't know enough to say, or what they know is too alarming to broadcast. I'm writing down everything I'm pulling in, time-stamped, in a dedicated notebook. I've also got a physical map of the region on the table, and I'm marking incident reports by location as I hear them. The pattern is not random. It's radiating outward from the urban cores. It's been about 24 hours since the first reports, and the edge of the incident zone is maybe 12 miles from the nearest suburb, which puts it roughly 10 miles from here. 10 miles is not far. I need to make some decisions today that I've been modeling in theory for years and have never actually had to make for real. The first one is the perimeter fence. The fence as it stands is a 5-foot woven wire livestock fence with 3 strands of barbed wire on top, all the way around the property's 4 acres. In my theoretical planning, I've always known that the final, secure configuration adds hardened posts at the gate and at the 4 corners, a wooden secondary brace along the weakest section of the south fence where the wire got old and I haven't replaced it yet, and a basic early warning system of vibration sensors and noisemakers that I can monitor from inside. I have all of this material. I need to spend today building it. I started at first light. There's a particular quality to this morning that I keep noticing and trying not to think about. It's quiet in the wrong way. Not early morning in the country quiet, which is actually full of bird noise and insects, and the distant sound of farm equipment starting up. This is a different quiet. The birds are making sounds, but they're shorter, more reactive. There's a dog barking somewhere south of here, not Craig's direction, further, and it's been going continuously since I woke up. Continuous dog barking in the country is usually an alarm response to a specific stimulus. Whatever's triggering that dog, it's been there for a while. I work fast. I know this property like I know my own hands. The posts go in first, 8 of them, pressure treated, set with a post driver that I've had in the barn forever. The gate hardware takes longest because I'm adding a drop bar lock behind the existing padlock, which means cutting and welding, which means dragging the portable welder out of the barn and setting up in the open air. I don't like making that much noise right now, but there's no other option. The welding takes about 90 minutes. The secondary brace on the south fence is simpler. Just additional horizontal wire run tight between the existing posts, reinforcing the bottom section, which is where anything walking would push through. The early warning system goes up last. I'm using a combination of fishing line and cheap aluminum cans with rocks in them. This is not a sophisticated solution. It's the same thing Civil War soldiers used in camps, but it works. Anything moving through the fence, or leaning against it, makes noise. I run about 300 feet of it along the most vulnerable sections. By 2 p.m. I'm inside, eating and monitoring radio. The situation in the city channels has gotten worse. I can't see the city from here. I'm too far and there's a ridge between us. But based on what I'm hearing, city police dispatch is functioning at maybe 30% capacity, which I'm estimating from the ratio of calls to responses. The hospital channels have mostly gone silent, which is a bad sign. Silence on a hospital emergency channel means either they've moved to a secondary system I'm not monitoring, or the hospital is no longer functioning in an organized way. I'm also monitoring civilian CB channels, which is something most people forget exist. There's a lot of traffic. Some of it is panicked, garbled, people asking questions nobody's answering. Some of it is more organized. I'm hearing what sounds like a few different survivor groups forming up. People in neighborhoods who are pooling resources or trying to coordinate. That's good, in principle. It becomes complicated if any of those groups figure out there are more resources outside the city and start moving. The thing that keeps nagging at me, that I keep coming back to while I'm working, is the speed. I built my whole planning framework around a scenario that would give me time. Disease outbreaks have early phases. Economic collapses give you warning signals if you know where to look. Even rapid social breakdowns usually have a trailing period where things are bad but not completely gone. What I'm watching right now has none of that. From first reports yesterday morning to effective institutional collapse in the city in less than 36 hours. Something about this is faster than natural. I don't know what that means yet. I'm putting it in the notebook under the low confidence column, and I'm going to keep watching. Day 3. Morning. Craig called. He's alive. His wife, a woman named Helen who I've spoken to maybe 4 times, answered for him, because Craig had twisted his ankle, trying to get onto his roof to look toward the city, and couldn't get down. Classic Craig. He's okay, but he can't move well. Helen sounds calm on the phone, which I respect. I told her what I knew, which was more than what the radio was telling anyone. And there was a long pause when I finished, and she said, "Owen, that bunker you've got under that barn." She didn't phrase it as a question, and I said, "Yes, it's real. If you need it, come." And she said she'd talk to Craig. I also spotted my first infected today. I want to describe this carefully, because I know I'm going to be listening to this recording later, and I want to get the details right. It was early afternoon. I was doing an inspection of the north fence line from the inside, just walking the perimeter, checking that everything I'd built yesterday was holding, looking at the ground for tracks. The property has a small stand of trees along the north edge that I've left because they give good concealment from the road. When I was at the northeast corner, I stopped because there was something in the trees that wasn't a tree. It was a man, or it had been a man. He was standing about 30 feet into the trees, on the far side of the fence, facing sort of northeast, which is away from me. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I watched him for about 2 minutes. No movement at all. His head was down slightly. His arms were hanging. The back of his shirt was dark in a way that could have been sweat, or could have been something else. Then something, I don't know what, maybe a bird, maybe my boot shifting in the dirt, made a sound, and he turned. Not the way a person normally turns. He turned his whole upper body as one piece, slow, like a machine getting up to speed. And then, when his face came around toward me, he stopped. He was looking in my direction, but I couldn't tell if he was looking at me specifically, or just at the general area where the sound came from. His face was, look, I'm going to try to describe this without inflating it. His face had blood on it. Old blood, dry, on his chin and down his neck. His eyes were open, and they were tracking in a general way, but they didn't lock on me the way a person's eyes would. He just sort of faced my direction. His mouth was slightly open. He stood there for maybe 90 seconds. Then he started moving. Not toward me. He moved northeast, the direction he'd originally been facing, in a slow, loose-jointed walk that covered ground faster than it should have given how unhurried it looked. He walked out of the tree line on the far side and disappeared onto the road. I stayed at the fence line for another 10 minutes. He didn't come back. What I took from that, he responded to sound. When there was sound, he oriented toward it. When the sound stopped, he lost interest, or more accurately, he never seemed to gain specific interest, just general orientation, He didn't try to come through the fence when he saw me, which might mean he didn't see me clearly, or it might mean the fence was enough of a barrier that he didn't process it as crossable. He walked in a straight line. He didn't navigate around obstacles. He just encountered them and changed direction slightly. This is important, tactically important. A thing that moves toward sound and can't problem-solve obstacles is a very different threat than a thing that can think and plan. Different strategies apply. I went inside and added my observations to the notebook. That night, the dog that had been barking since yesterday morning finally stopped. I lay on the cot in the shelter listening to the silence where it had been and couldn't sleep for a long time. Day 4, afternoon. Something happened this morning that I didn't plan for and that I want to get down accurately while it's still sharp. I was running my regular early morning radio check, 4 to 6 a.m., when propagation is cleanest, when I picked up something on a frequency I've had flagged for a while. It's a secondary emergency services frequency, the kind that public safety agencies switch to when their primary is compromised. What I heard was a woman's voice, calm, professional, with that particular controlled quality you develop when your job involves delivering bad news regularly. She was giving a situation report, not to me specifically, just transmitting into the air because she had a radio and was trying to reach someone. The report went, she had been responding to a mass casualty incident at an interstate rest stop about 4 miles east of my property. Her ambulance had been overrun. Her partner was gone. She was sheltering in the ambulance, had her medical bag, had a radio, had a handgun with 11 rounds, and her fuel was down to maybe enough to drive 10 miles. She gave her rough coordinates based on route markers. I sat with that information for about 4 minutes, which feels like a long time when I replay it, but in real time it felt short. My operating protocols have always said, clearly, that I do not expose my location to unknowns in the early phase of an incident. The risk is too high. People in crisis become unpredictable, and the moment anyone knows you have resources, you have a security problem. This is not a cruel policy. It's a mathematically justified one, when survival is the objective. The woman on the radio had medical training. She had already done a proper sit rep, which means she was organized and professional under stress. She was 4 miles away with mobility. She was not asking for charity. She was transmitting a status report. I got on the radio. I kept it brief. I said, "Copy your position. I have a secure location 4 miles west on Route 9. I can talk you in if you're mobile. I have supplies and a safe approach." Then I gave a single identifying landmark and signed off. She came back 30 seconds later. She said, "Who is this?" Not a question. The way I said it. A demand. I said my name. I said I was a civilian. I had a prepped property. I was alone. I said I wasn't going to give more information than that on an open channel, and if she was coming, she should move within the next 2 hours before the roads got more complicated. There was about a 90-second gap. Then she said, "What's the approach?" Her name is Nora. Nora Rydell. She's 34. She's been a paramedic for 8 years. She grew up in a small town in Western Virginia, which explains the practical quality she has, the way she doesn't waste words, and doesn't seem to need to fill silence with reassurance, the way some people do under stress. She arrived at 9:20 a.m. The ambulance she drove in had a shattered passenger window and a dent on the driver's side rear panel that she told me she didn't look at directly when she was driving. I had the gate open and closed behind her in under 30 seconds. We got the ambulance into the barn next to my truck. She stood in the barn and looked around at what I'd built, the hidden camera monitors, the antenna setup, the generator room visible through the open door, and she said, "You were already ready for this." I said yes. She looked at me for a second, not accusatory, more like she was recalibrating. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I told her the honest answer, which was that I had no significant medical training beyond basic first aid. I had supplies and equipment I couldn't fully use. She had skills I didn't have. The arrangement would be mutual. She said okay, and we went inside, and I made coffee on the propane burner, and she sat at the table in the shelter's main room and ate 2 cans of food without talking, while I kept monitoring the radio. That's how Nora arrived. No drama, No ceremony. Just a paramedic eating canned soup in my bunker while the world came apart on the radio above us. I want to note something that I didn't say to her then, and that I'm saying now, because these recordings are eventually going to be the full account. I had about a 45-second window where I almost didn't respond. I sat there with my finger over the transmit button, and I thought about my protocols and my calculations and the mathematical justification for not exposing myself. And then I thought about this. I built everything under this property alone. I spent 9 years building it alone because I thought being alone was the safest option. And the first time I actually had to use it, sitting in this underground room at 4 a.m. while the world went sideways, I couldn't sleep and I couldn't eat, and the silence was not comfortable. It was just silence. So I keyed the radio. That's not in my protocols, but it's the truth. Day 5. Full day. Craig and Helen came. Craig was hobbling but mobile enough. They brought their own truck loaded with what I'd asked for. Their NAS box and all the hard drives from their house, their generator and its fuel, 60 pounds of dry dog food that will turn out to be useful in ways I wasn't thinking about when I asked for it, and Helen's medical kit from her years as a veterinary technician. I didn't know Helen had veterinary training. You don't know what people carry until you ask. Their dog came too. A big shepherd mix named Bert, which is exactly the right name for a dog that big. Bert is relevant to this account for reasons that will become clear later. I spent most of day 5 doing 3 things in rotation: monitoring radio, doing a full physical inventory of everything we now had between 4 people, and having a planning meeting around the kitchen table in the shelter. I've been running these meetings with the same structure since I started doing tabletop exercises years ago. Situation, resources, threats, priorities. Having other people in the room makes it feel different, not less focused, just different. There are gaps that get filled by other people asking questions you hadn't thought of. Nora's first question after I'd gone through the inventory was, "What's your waste management plan?" Which is not a glamorous question, but it is a real one. Long-term habitation of a closed space creates biological waste. I have a composting toilet in the shelter that vents properly. I also have the full facility in the house above. We developed a protocol for managing that, which I'll spare the details of, but which took about 40 minutes to fully work out, and which Nora drove almost entirely from a practical standpoint. Helen's question was about the ventilation. She'd noticed the fan cycling and asked what the filtration was rated for. I walked her through the system. HEPA to 0.3 microns. Positive pressure when we want to keep things out. Negative pressure if we needed to isolate a room. She nodded at everything I said without asking what a micron was, which told me she understood the scale of what I was describing. Craig's question was the one that took longest to answer. He said, "What's our plan if someone shows up who we don't know and they're in bad shape?" We talked about that for a while. What we landed on was this. Anyone who comes to the property stays outside the fence until we've had a verbal interview through the gate. We ask what their situation is. We watch their behavior. We check for obvious injury. If they're healthy and their story is coherent and they have something to contribute, skills, supplies, information, we consider them. If they're injured, Nora assesses through the fence before any gate opens. If they're too far gone, infected, or so psychologically broken they're unpredictable, we direct them away from the property. We don't engage further. That last part was the hard part to agree on. Craig didn't like it. He kept circling back to it. I understood why. I also knew that a group of 4 people with finite supplies cannot help everyone, and trying to can get everyone killed. We ended up with the policy in place, but with no comfortable feelings about it. That's probably the right place to end up. Day 5 into night. Radio traffic around 11 p.m. caught my attention. There's a woman I've been tracking. She's been broadcasting on a CB frequency since day 1, giving updates from somewhere inside Harlow. She goes by Radio Rita, which is either an actual name or a pseudonym, I can't tell. Tonight she was describing what she could see from a high floor of a building. She's been in a downtown office tower, I think, and what she described was a crowd. A very large crowd of infected in the streets below her. She wasn't panicking. She was describing it the way a reporter would. The size of the crowd was what stayed with me. She said she couldn't count them because they stretched out of her line of sight in 2 directions. I wrote that down. Then I did something I don't usually let myself do, which is sit there and think about what a crowd of infected that size means in terms of movement. A large, slow-moving group that responds to sound and moves in broadly the direction of noise will eventually spread out from the urban center. It will go where there are sounds to follow. Roads. Routes that channel movement. I've been thinking of the infected as a general threat that you manage with distance and offense. I need to start thinking about them as a fluid that moves through channels, and that will eventually find the path of least resistance out of the city. That path runs within about 1.5 miles of this property. I went to sleep with that thought, and didn't sleep well. Day 6. Big day. 2 things happened that I need to get down in detail. The first, I heard something on the shortwave at around 7 a.m. that I've been chewing on ever since. It was a brief, fragmentary transmission on a frequency I've been monitoring that's typically used for government-to-government emergency coordination, not public safety, a different layer up. The kind of channel that exists, but that most civilians don't know about. I know about it because about 5 years ago, I spent several months cataloging government emergency frequencies as part of my general prep research, and I found this one, almost by accident, while chasing an interference source on a nearby frequency. The transmission was encoded. Not fully. It seemed like it was supposed to be encoded, but the operator had made a mistake somewhere in the setup, because about 20 seconds of it came through in clear voice before it shifted to cipher. What I heard in those 20 seconds was a male voice, flat affect, not panicked, giving what sounded like a containment status report. The 2 phrases that came through clearly were Vector Distribution Exceeding Model and Eastern Corridor Assessment Teams Non-Responsive. Then the encryption kicked in, and I got nothing but data tones. Vector Distribution Exceeding Model. That's not disease surveillance language. That's not public health language. That's operational language. Someone somewhere had a model for how this would spread, and what they're seeing is exceeding that model, which means 2 things. 1, this was modeled in advance, which means it was anticipated in some form. 2, reality is worse than the model, which means their planning is already outdated. Eastern Corridor Assessment Teams, non-responsive. Assessment teams are people they sent somewhere to assess the situation. Non-responsive means those teams aren't communicating back, which could mean infrastructure failure, or it could mean the teams are gone. I sat with that for a long time. I put it in the notebook in a section I'm now calling Signals I Can't Fully Interpret But Won't Ignore. The second thing that happened today, someone came to the gate. Around noon, I saw them on the camera system I've had running since day 2. A woman, maybe 55, maybe 60, walking up the drive with a bag over one shoulder and a child behind her. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She was walking carefully, watching the sides of the road, and when she reached the gate, she looked directly at the camera on the post, which most people don't notice, and said, "I know someone's watching. I just need to stop for a minute. I don't want anything." I got on the exterior speaker system I'd rigged up. I said, "I see you. Stay where you are for a moment." I ran through the assessment protocol. Both of them were moving normally. No visible injuries. The woman was sweating and tired, but controlled. The boy was holding her hand and looking at the fence, not distressed but watchful. Neither was showing any of the behaviors I'd been cataloging from the infected. The loose joints, the directionless orientation, the absence of purposeful gaze. I went to the gate and interviewed her through it. Her name was Janice Aldred. She lived about 3 miles south, a house on a rural route. Her husband had gone into town on day 1 to pick up her mother and had not come back. She had waited until this morning and then left because she'd seen 2 infected people on her road last night and she didn't think the house was safe anymore. She had a backpack with food, a first aid kit, her medication. She was a type 2 diabetic, managed with pills currently, though she mentioned she had some injectable insulin as well, in a cold pack. And the boy, whose name was Dennis, and who was her grandson, not her son, which she mentioned as if it changed something about the situation. He was there because his parents were in Denver, and she didn't know how to reach them. I looked at Nora through the gate camera feed. She was watching the monitor in the shelter. I keyed the interior radio and said, "What do you think?" She said, "Diabetic medication is something we should have." The kid is calm. She looks like she knows how to handle herself. "But it's your call." That last part she said straightforwardly, not deferring, just acknowledging that we'd agreed on a process, and the final call was mine at the gate. I opened the gate. Janice walked through and Dennis followed, and she turned and looked at the gate closing behind them, and then looked at me and said, "Thank you." Not like she was relieved, more like she was acknowledging a transaction that had real weight on both sides. That was the right read. She understood what she was walking into. We were 5 people now, and 1 dog, and a 9-year-old boy who would turn out to be one of the more useful people in this group, in ways nobody would have predicted at the outset. Day 7, a week in. I want to talk about the infected, not the one I saw on day 3 at the fence. More broadly, what I've been piecing together from a week of observations, radio reports, CB traffic, and 2 more direct sightings from the property. They walk. That's the dominant mode of movement. They don't run. I've heard reports of something faster in some radio traffic, but on the handful of infected I've observed directly, and in Nora's account of what she saw at the rest stop, they walk, and not fast. A slow, forward-weighted walk that looks like someone going somewhere specific, but without actual direction. They cover ground but not efficiently. They respond to sound. This is the most consistent behavioral characteristic across everything I'm seeing. Any significant sound, engine noise, voices, anything that carries, draws them toward the source. They orient toward the sound and begin moving. They don't stop immediately when the sound stops. They seem to continue in the last direction for some period of time before drifting. So you can lead them, theoretically. But once you've drawn them toward you, you need to keep moving because they're already committed to that direction. They don't problem solve. The fence line observation I made on day 3 has been confirmed by multiple radio accounts from other survivors. The infected will walk into a fence and push against it and eventually change direction if the fence holds. They don't look for a gap. They don't try a different approach. They push in one spot, and if it doesn't give, they eventually drift away. This is probably the most tactically useful thing I know about them. They don't communicate. I haven't heard any radio account describing infected individuals coordinating with each other, alerting each other, or in any way acting as a group with shared information. When a crowd of them moves together, it seems to be coincidence of direction rather than coordination. They've all independently oriented toward the same sound source, and they're all moving toward it. In a crowd, they look like they're working together. They're not. They're just a lot of individuals responding to the same stimulus. They don't climb. Anything vertical, they seem to have no ability to engage with. Can't climb a fence. Can't navigate stairs well from what I'm hearing in the radio reports. Can't get through any kind of overhead obstacle. A ground-level barrier is all you need. They don't open doors. No accounts anywhere of infected successfully operating a door. Doorknobs, handles, push bars, none of it. They walk into closed doors and push. And if the door holds, they eventually move away. What they do that's dangerous is bite. That seems to be the transmission vector, and it's fast. The time between bite and transition to infected state varies based on the reports I've seen, anywhere from a few hours to perhaps a day, but the endpoint is consistent, and a crowd of them will overwhelm simply by contact and numbers. I'm keeping this behavioral analysis updated in the notebook. It's going to matter for every decision we make about moving outside the fence. Day 7 continued. The hydroponic bay is producing its first usable growth. Spinach, mostly. Nora harvested it and made something with canned beans and canned chicken that wasn't good exactly, but was warm and fresh in a way that you notice more than you'd expect when everything else has been out of a can. Dennis ate 2 bowls. Janice watched him eat and didn't look at anything specific. I understood that. Day 8. 2 things in the notebook today. The first, I ran the numbers on supplies. With 5 adults, 1 child, and a dog, here's where we sit. Food. The 3-year single-person reserve compresses to roughly 9 months for 6 mouths, accounting for the dog's food separately. Water. The static reserve at full consumption is about 4 months, with rainwater collection supplementing at an unpredictable rate based on weather. Power. Solar and wind are sufficient for essential systems indefinitely. Propane for the generator is about 60 days of peak operation. Medical. This is actually our best area now that Nora's medical bag has been added to my existing stock. The gaps. Food is the most obvious. 9 months sounds like a lot, but it isn't when you don't know what comes after it. Seeds are there for a spring planting, but seeds need a spring, and we're currently in early fall. And outside food sources, the region we're in has farms, small stores, other properties. Those won't last much longer as the situation extends. I started mapping supply runs. The existing road maps I have are detailed. I've been collecting them for years. Everything from county road atlases to USKI's topographic maps. And I've been marking on them what I know about the local area in terms of resources. Within a 10-mile radius, there are at least 3 small farms I know of. A feed and grain store in a town about 6 miles east that will have things like salt and bulk dry goods. A small family pharmacy about 4 miles south, and a rural grocery store I've driven past 100 times that's probably been picked over, but not necessarily cleaned out. The challenge is getting there without attracting attention, and getting back without being followed. Second thing, I found something I can't entirely explain. I was doing the evening fence line walk. I've been doing this daily at dusk, just walking the full perimeter and checking the warning lines, when I noticed that in the southeast corner, about 8 feet of the warning line had been taken down. Not broken, taken down. The cans were sitting on the ground in a neat row, and the fishing line was coiled loosely next to them, like someone had lowered the line deliberately to pass through without triggering it, and then set the components down carefully. No tracks I could make sense of in the low light. The fence itself was intact. Nothing had come through. Just the warning line was down in that 8-foot section. I stood there for a while looking at it. Then I went and got Bert, the shepherd, and brought him to that section of fence. He sniffed around thoroughly, and then sat down and looked toward the trees on the far side of the fence, and made a sound that was not a bark. A low sound in his chest, somewhere between a growl and something I can't name. Then he got up and walked away from the fence toward the house without being directed. I told Craig about it later. We agreed to watch that corner more carefully. We didn't have an explanation. I reinstated the warning line and added a second layer with heavier cans. Day 9. Supply run planning. I spent this day on logistics, which is the kind of work that feels ordinary but isn't. Planning a safe movement through a partially compromised area takes time if you're doing it right. I spread the maps out and went through the route to the feed store with Craig, talking through every point where we'd need to cross a road, every spot where we might encounter bottlenecks, every location where sound from the truck would carry in a way that could attract attention. We decided on the smallest and quietest vehicle. My truck is a diesel, which runs rough at low speed. Craig's truck is a gas model, quieter and smaller. We took all the unnecessary weight out of it, added a pair of handheld radios, gave one to Nora, who would stay at the property as the radio operator, packed basic tools, basic medical, and 3 empty containers for anything we found that needed carrying. Nora and I went over what to look for at the pharmacy stop. She gave me a specific list. She knew what she wanted, and she knew exactly what names to look for on the pharmacy shelves. I wrote it down and put it in my pocket. She said if I could only carry 1 box of one thing, get the broad-spectrum antibiotics. I said I understood. Janice offered to come on the run, and I told her no. With her diabetes situation, I wasn't taking any risks that weren't necessary. She didn't argue, but she didn't look happy about it either. Craig drove. I navigated. We left at 10 a.m. The drive out was surreal in a specific way I want to describe accurately. The road from my property to the county route is familiar. I've driven it hundreds of times, but everything familiar about it looked subtly wrong. Not dramatically changed, just wrong in the details. A mailbox at the Henley farm left open. A pickup truck in a field, parked at an angle nobody parks a truck in unless they stopped suddenly. A pair of shoes in the middle of the road that we drove around slowly, neither of us saying anything. No people, no moving people I mean. No infected visible either, not on this stretch of road. The absence of both felt stranger than the presence of either would have. We got to the feed store in 19 minutes. It's a regional agricultural supply place. The kind of store that has everything from livestock feed to motor oil to basic hardware on its shelves. The parking lot was empty, except for a delivery truck parked by the loading dock that hadn't been moved in days based on the flat front left tire. Craig backed the truck up to the loading dock so we could load directly. I took point going inside. The store was empty of people, not trashed. It hadn't been ransacked the way a grocery or pharmacy might have been. Most people don't think of a feed store in a crisis, and whoever had come here before us had taken mainly food items from the small retail section in front and left the bulk agricultural goods completely untouched. We loaded 200 pounds of mixed grain seed, 50 pounds of table salt in agricultural blocks, a full case of canning wax and lids, 4 gallons of bleach from the cleaning supplies section, a box of veterinary syringes and basic veterinary medications that Helen asked for specifically, 40 pounds of dry dog food, rope, basic hardware, a manual hand truck, a box of large Ziploc bags, and a hand pump originally designed for moving liquid fertilizer that I had specific plans for, related to the fuel situation. We were in and out in 31 minutes. No sound from outside. No one came. The pharmacy was different. We pulled up, and I knew from the parking lot it had been visited before us. The front glass was broken. Someone had gone through it fast, probably in the first day or two. Inside was the expected aftermath of a panic raid. Everything from the basic over-the-counter section cleared, the cosmetics and personal care largely untouched, and the prescription dispensary area partially ransacked but not completely. The good news about pharmacies is that systematic ransackers usually take what's recognizable, pain medications, specific brand name drugs, and leave anything that requires medical knowledge to identify. We found most of what Nora had listed. Not everything, but the broad-spectrum antibiotics were there, untouched, because whoever came before us had taken the opioids from the controlled substances cabinet and left the antimicrobials completely alone. I loaded everything on Nora's list, added wound care supplies, added a case of blood glucose test strips I found behind the counter, which was going to matter for Janice, added 2 boxes of surgical gloves in various sizes, and 2 masks from the pharmacist's personal supply on a hook near the back door. We were almost out when Craig, who was watching the front from just inside the broken window, said quietly, "Owen, just my name, with a particular flatness that I've learned means pay attention right now." I came to the front and looked out. There was a group of infected coming up the street. Not large, maybe 9 or 10, moving in that characteristic forward-leaning shuffle. They were going to pass the pharmacy at about 20 feet, too close. We stayed completely still for what felt like a long time. The group moved past. They didn't turn. They didn't stop. One of them walked almost directly into a newspaper box on the curb, hit it with its shoulder, turned slightly from the contact, and continued walking. None of them looked toward the pharmacy. We waited until they were out of sight. Then we loaded the last of the medical supplies and drove back. I drove on the way home. We didn't talk much. About halfway back, Craig said, "There are going to be more of those in a few days," meaning the infected on the street. I said, "Yeah." He said, "We should do another run before that happens." I said, "I'd been thinking the same thing." Back at the property by 1 p.m., Nora met us at the gate and helped unload, and then did a proper inventory of the medical supplies with a care that made it clear she was already thinking about what she'd need them for. The blood glucose strips made her stop and look at me. I said I knew Janice would need them. Nora said, "She's going to be okay for a while," like she was reassuring herself as much as telling me. Day 9 into evening. I ran the radio for 4 hours straight. Here's what changed in the traffic. The government EAS loops have stopped. There's nothing on those frequencies now. That channel, which had been running since day 1, is silent. A government emergency broadcast stopping without explanation is not a good sign. It means either the facility running it is no longer operational, or whoever was running it has made a decision that broadcasting is no longer useful or possible. The police and emergency service channels have gone mostly silent too. There are a few isolated transmissions. A county channel in an area about 40 miles north that's still operational apparently. But the regional emergency infrastructure, as I knew it, has stopped functioning. What's still active? civilian CB, amateur radio, and a collection of what seem to be independent survivor group channels that are emerging organically on frequencies nobody's officially claimed. These are the channels I'm now spending most of my monitoring time on. The information quality is lower. People in crisis who don't know radio discipline saying things in random order. But the volume is higher, and sometimes a detail surfaces that you wouldn't get from a formal channel. Tonight, a detail surfaced that went directly into the low-confidence but tracking column of the notebook. A woman on a CB channel was describing something she'd seen on the edge of Harlow, near the Eastern Industrial District. She was a neighbor of a woman named Deborah, who had apparently not been home in 3 days, and she'd gone to check on Deborah and found her street blocked by a line of infected standing in a row. Not a crowd, a line. She said there were maybe 15 of them, shoulder to shoulder across the road, all facing the same direction, not moving, like they were waiting. She said it twice, like they were waiting. I don't have an explanation for that. The behavioral model I've been building doesn't have room for that. Infected individuals orienting toward a sound source in the same direction at the same time would look like a group facing the same way, but standing in a row, shoulder to shoulder, is a different thing. That's a configuration. That implies something spatial about the arrangement that doesn't fit what I understand about how these things move and respond. I put it in the notebook. I flagged it. I'm going to be watching for this specifically. Day 10. Morning. Things I've noticed about the people in this shelter after 10 days. Nora sleeps 4 hours, wakes up, does a circuit of the shelter and checks on everyone, then goes back to sleep for another 2. This is a paramedic habit, the checking cycle. She doesn't do it consciously. She just does it, like breathing. The first time I woke up at 2 a.m. and saw her moving through the dark, I almost had a significant incident. Now I just hear it and go back to sleep. Craig spends his evenings building things. He doesn't have my engineering background, but he has 40 years of farm and general mechanical experience, which in many ways is more broadly applicable than my electrical work. In the evenings, he goes through the tool inventory and he identifies things that should be modified, reinforced, or built from scratch. He's been working on a hand-pulled cart made from a steel wheelbarrow frame and some surplus angle iron from the barn. He moves slowly because of his ankle. He doesn't complain about the ankle, not once. Helen is the one who's been managing the food, not by assignment. She just started doing it, and nobody questioned it because she was doing it well. She has a system where she logs every can and packet opened, tracks the consumption rate, and adjusts portions when she's identified waste. She's doing this with the same quiet precision she presumably brought to managing health records at a veterinary office. She doesn't talk much about her previous life. When she does, it's usually practical. She'll mention something from experience that's relevant to whatever problem is in front of us. Janice reads. She found a box of paperback books in the shelter that I'd put there, without much thought about their specific titles. They were part of a job lot of survival library materials I'd bought at an estate sale. And she reads them methodically. She takes notes on things she finds useful in a small notebook she brought with her. She reads to Dennis in the evenings for about 40 minutes, regardless of what's happening or what we're planning. She has never missed this routine since day 5, not once. Dennis. I have complicated feelings about how to describe Dennis. He's 9. He's smart in a way that's sometimes surprising. He watches everything. And when he asks questions, which he does, regularly, in a direct way that adults often avoid, the questions are usually ones that cut to something important. On day 7, he asked me, sitting at the table while I was working on maps, "Do you know if it's going to get worse before it gets better?" I told him the honest answer, which was that, based on what I was seeing, yes, probably, and that our job was to be ready. He considered that for about 5 seconds and said, "Okay," and went back to the book he was reading. No performance of distress, no false reassurance from me, just information and acknowledgement. He started paying attention to the radio with me in the mornings. He doesn't understand everything, but he asks about what he doesn't understand, and he remembers the answers. Day 10, the southeast corner again. The warning line was down again. Same section, same careful placement of components. The line lowered, not broken, and the cans set on the ground with a kind of deliberateness that I'm having trouble attributing to anything but intentional action. This time, there was something else. On the outside of the fence, pressed into the soft ground by the base of a post, was a boot print. Single print, left foot, size 11 or 12, deep enough that whoever made it was standing there long enough to apply real downward pressure, not just stepping past. The print was fresh, made within the last few hours. Someone is visiting that corner of the fence, coming from the trees on the far side, lowering the warning line from the outside, standing at the fence post, and leaving. Not infected. The infected don't do things like carefully lower a warning line. A person is doing this. A person who doesn't want to be heard coming close to the fence. I told the group at the planning meeting that night. There was a long silence. Craig said, "That's not random." I said I knew. Nora said, "What do they want?" I said I didn't know yet, but they keep coming back. Helen said, "Maybe they're checking if we're still here." We put a watch on that corner. 2-hour rotations starting at dusk. The first night nobody came while we were watching. But the second night, just before I came off my watch and went to get Craig for his rotation, Bert the shepherd was lying next to me on the ground. He'd taken to sitting with whoever was on watch, which I'd started to think of as useful, and at about 2 a.m. he lifted his head and looked toward the trees. Not the alert, hard focus of a threat response. Something softer than that, like recognition. I looked at the trees. There was nothing I could see in the dark. Bert put his head back down. I sat with that for the rest of my watch rotation. When Craig came to relieve me, I told him what I'd seen. He said, "Bert doesn't do that for something he doesn't know." I said, "Yeah." He said, "So who does he know that's been missing since day one?" I thought about that the whole way back to the shelter. Craig's nearest neighbor, before us, 3 miles down the road, was Ray Holcomb. Ray was a retired mail carrier, 60-something, lived alone since his wife passed, kept a small vegetable garden and 2 cats, and attended our informal rural neighborhood meetings about once a year. Ray and Craig had known each other for 20-some years. And Bert? Bert had stayed at Ray's place for 2 weeks last summer, when Craig and Helen went to see their daughter. The boot print was a size 11 or 12. I don't know Ray's shoe size. But I'm going to find out. Day 10, night. Last entry for this section. The regional radio traffic has settled into a new, quieter pattern that's almost worse than the chaos of the first few days. Chaos has information in it. This silence, the deliberate, managed quiet of channels that have simply stopped broadcasting, doesn't. What I have is one county emergency channel 40 miles north, still functioning. The civilian CB patchwork, unreliable but alive. A handful of amateur radio operators who've started coordinating information in a way that's actually useful once you learn their reporting discipline, and that one government frequency where I occasionally get fragments, still mostly encoded. What I know after 10 days, the infected are spreading outward from the urban cores, but slower than I initially feared, partly because they're not being drawn by anything specific in the rural areas, and partly because large bodies of water seem to channel and contain them. There's a river about 8 miles south that's acting as a natural barrier based on the distribution of reports. The road networks are becoming more dangerous, not because of the infected specifically, but because the infected are a fixed threat that doesn't change, and the desperate human survivors are a variable threat that absolutely does. We've seen no one try the gate except Janice and Dennis, and they came clean. But it's been 10 days. The city's food stores are gone. The suburban houses have been stripped. People who were in the city 10 days ago and made it out are going to be looking for something to take. We're not invisible. We haven't been doing anything to make us visible, but we also can't guarantee we're unknown. The road exists. The property has structures. Anyone with a map and a line of sight will eventually see the antenna on the barn if they get close enough. I've started the next set of fortifications. Craig is involved. We're not going to stop building until what we have is the most defensible thing we can make it. But I keep coming back to the southeast corner, to the careful, deliberate way someone keeps visiting it in the dark. To Bert, who is not a dog that shows recognition lightly. Tomorrow I'm going to check something. I'm going to leave something at the base of the fence post in that corner. Not a message, not yet. Just something that makes it clear. We know you're there, and we're not hostile. A bottle of water, and a small sealed bag of food. We'll see what happens to it. That's day 10. That's the first 10 days. I don't know what comes next. I know we're better prepared than almost anyone in this region right now. I know the group I've gathered is functional and decent in ways I didn't plan for. I know there's something I don't understand about the southeast corner of my fence, and something I don't understand about that government transmission, and something I don't understand about the standing row of infected a woman described on the eastern edge of Harlow. I've built my whole life around the idea that understanding the threat is the first step to surviving it. I understand parts of this. I don't understand enough of it yet. Let me sit on the food and the water at the fence post overnight. If it's still there in the morning, maybe it means nobody came. If it's gone, if someone took it, then I need to decide quickly what step comes after acknowledging we know they're there. I'm going to take that one day at a time, same as everything else. Day 11. The food was gone. I want to start there because I've been sitting on it since 6 a.m., and it's 9 a.m. now, and I still don't quite know what to do with it. The bottle of water and the sealed bag of food I left at the base of the fence post in the southeast corner last night. They're gone. Not scattered, not knocked over by an animal, not sitting open 3 feet away the way a raccoon would leave them. Gone. Someone took them deliberately. There's a smear in the soft ground near the post that I can't fully read in the early light, but it looks like a knee, like someone knelt down in the dirt to pick up the items without making noise, to make themselves small at the fence line. I stood there for a while in the cold and thought about what this means. The most important thing it means is alive. Whoever is coming to this corner of the fence is alive, is functional, is capable of deliberate and cautious behavior, and is in enough need that food and water left by an unknown party at a fence they've been quietly visiting is worth taking. The second thing it means is they're not ready to show themselves yet. I respect that, actually. If I were in the position of having found a property with signs of habitation, and I didn't know who was inside, and I'd been approaching quietly at night to assess, I'd want a few more data points before I knocked. What I left last night was a data point. It said, "We see the visits. We're not hostile. Here's something for your immediate needs. What comes next is up to them." I went back inside and told the group. Craig sat very still while I described it. When I finished, he said, "Put something out again tonight." And then he said, "And put a note with it." He didn't say what the note should say. He didn't have to. I wrote the note on a card, laminated it the way I laminate important documents, and put it in a sealed bag with the next food and water. The note said, "We know you've been coming here. We don't know who you are, but we're not hostile. If you want to talk, come to the gate in daylight. If you're not ready for that, we'll keep leaving things here until you are. We have medical supplies and food and enough room. We're not a threat to you." I put my first name at the bottom, just Owen, no last name. Then I sat on the radio. Day 11 continued. Something on the frequency. I want to explain something technical for a second, because it matters. When I built my radio setup, I included a device I designed myself, a modified spectrum analyzer that I can use to monitor signal activity across a broad frequency range simultaneously, rather than monitoring individual channels one at a time. It shows me a visual map of which frequencies have active transmission at any given moment, which lets me notice patterns that you'd miss if you were scanning channels sequentially. I've been running this passive monitoring in the background continuously since day 1. Today, at around 2 p.m., I noticed something. There's a signal on a frequency in the lower VHF range, below the public safety bands, in a range that's technically allocated to government communications, but that I've never seen active in this region in 11 years of monitoring, that started transmitting at approximately 11 a.m. and has been running continuously since. It's not voice, it's a tone pattern, repeating. A digital signal of some kind, not standard digital communication protocol that I recognize, which doesn't mean it isn't standard. It might be encrypted or proprietary, but the signal itself is there, running, steady, coming from a direction that my directional antenna setup puts somewhere to the northeast, which is the direction of the larger city, but possibly beyond it. I can record the signal. I can analyze the pattern. I'm not sure yet what it means, but something northeast of us has been transmitting a steady tone signal since this morning, and that started on day 11, not day 1, which means it's something that was set up or activated after the initial chaos, Not before. I put it in the notebook. I'll keep monitoring. Day 12. We need to talk about the grocery run. Craig's ankle has improved enough that he's walking without the visible limp he had on day 5. Helen says another week, and he'll be fully functional. I'm glad to have him more mobile, because the next supply run is more complicated than the feed store trip, and I wanted him available. The rural grocery store I've been planning to hit is a family-owned place called Aldermere Market, about 7 miles east. In normal times, it carries a typical small grocery inventory, plus an expanded section of bulk dry goods that caters to the farming community around it. I've shopped there. I know the layout. What I don't know is what's happened to it in 12 days. I've been listening for any radio traffic that references it specifically, and today I got something. A woman on a CB channel, not Radio Rita, a different woman I haven't heard before, was describing a route she'd taken yesterday that went past Aldermere. She said there were vehicles in the parking lot, multiple vehicles, and she said there were people at the entrance. She used the word guards. She'd driven past without stopping. Guards at a grocery store on day 12 means someone's claimed it. That's a significant tactical problem. I went over it with Nora and Craig separately, and then together. The options are, go and try to negotiate access. Go and try to take what we need by force. Go quietly and find an alternative way in. Or don't go to Aldermere at all, and focus on other sources. Not going is the safest option. It's also the option that leaves us with 9 months of food and a steadily narrowing window for accumulating more before travel becomes genuinely impossible. Going quietly means reconnaissance first. Before we commit to any approach, I want to know what we're dealing with at Aldermere. That means someone needs to get eyes on the place from a safe distance. I decided to go alone. Nora didn't like it. She made her case. 2 people are safer than 1. She's trained for high-pressure situations. She can handle herself. All of this is true. I told her she was also the only medically trained person in this shelter, and that I was not going to put her in a position where if something went wrong with me, this group also lost its medical capability. She held her argument for a few seconds and then let it go. She understood the logic. I left at 7 a.m. on day 12 with the truck's engine warm, 1 radio, my binoculars, and a route that kept me off the main road for most of the approach. I parked about a half-mile from the market in a farm access lane that's tucked between 2 fields and walked the rest of the way through the tree line along the road. What I found at Aldermere: 4 vehicles in the parking lot, 2 pickup trucks, an SUV, and what I think was a step van of some kind, like a small delivery vehicle, parked diagonally across the handicap spaces. The entrance to the market had 2 people standing at it. Male, I thought, though hard to tell from 200 feet. They were not dressed in any kind of uniform. They were both holding things. I couldn't make out what specifically until I got the binoculars on them and identified a long gun on one and what might have been a baseball bat on the other. The market appeared to be in use. Lights were on inside. They had power from somewhere, probably a generator, and I could see movement through the windows periodically. I watched for about 45 minutes. In that time, 1 vehicle left, the SUV, driving east, and nothing else changed at the entrance. Nobody else arrived. The 2 at the entrance stood there and occasionally exchanged a few words and didn't move much. What I couldn't determine was how many people were inside, what their resource situation was, or what their threshold for hostile action was. The men at the entrance were a deterrent display, not necessarily a reflection of organizational capability. Small, scared groups sometimes put their best-looking people at the front to make themselves seem more formidable. I went back to the truck and drove the long way home, stopping at a back road I'd noted on the map that goes past a small farm equipment dealership that I hadn't previously considered as a supply source. The dealership was unlocked. The door was open, in fact, the kind of open that means someone left in a hurry, and I went in fast and came out with 4 5-gallon fuel cans, a manual siphon pump, 2 boxes of mechanical hardware from the maintenance shop, a pair of 2-way radios still in packaging that were apparently part of a dealership fleet communication system, and a physical road atlas of the Tri-County area that was sitting on the counter near the register with a coffee cup next to it, whose contents had long gone cold. Good stop, drove home. I reported the Aldermere situation at the evening meeting. We agreed. No approach until we know more. Monitor. See if any radio traffic gives us information about who they are. Plan the fuel situation in the meantime, because the truck being our primary transport means fuel management is now a priority. Day 13. Ray. The note was taken from the fence post and replaced with something. I want to get this right because every detail matters. What they put there. A folded piece of paper, sealed in a Ziploc bag and tucked into the fence mesh at the same post. I got to the corner at 6 a.m., and it was there. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky. Not the kind of shaky that comes from being elderly. I've seen Ray Holcomb write on a clipboard at the neighborhood meetings, and he had a steady hand. But the kind of shaky that comes from someone who is having difficulty with fine motor control. The pen had pressed hard enough to tear the paper in one spot. The note said, "Owen, I know who you are. I know this property. I'm sorry for the sneaking. I got hurt, and I'm scared of what you'll think. I need help, but I'm not sure I should come in. I'm not one of those things. I promise I'm not one of those things. But something happened, and I need someone to look at me. There's something wrong with me that isn't right. Can the doctor come to the fence alone? I won't hurt them." Signed with an initial, R. I sat down in the dirt at the fence line and held that piece of paper for a while. Something wrong with me that isn't right. I went inside and gave the note to Nora without saying who I thought it was from. She read it twice. Then she said, "I'll go." Just that. I said I thought I knew who it was. I told her about Ray, about Bert's behavior at the fence, about the boot print. She listened. When I finished, she said, "Someone got hurt in the first few days and has been surviving out there alone for 12 days, with something wrong with them, and they're asking for help. I'm going." She was already putting her medical bag together before I'd finished processing the sentence. We went together, Nora and I, at mid-morning. We told Craig and Helen where we were going and why. Helen looked at the door for a second and then said, "Bring him in if you can." Craig said nothing, but he put his hand on Bert's collar, and Bert sat perfectly still, which was its own kind of statement. We stood at the southeast corner of the fence and waited. Nora held her bag. I held nothing, specifically to show empty hands to whoever might be watching from the trees. After about 8 minutes, the trees moved in a place that had no wind, and something came out. I knew it was Ray. I recognized the build and the way he moved, which was a slight forward lean he'd always had, a habit from a career of carrying heavy mail sacks. But he looked different. He was thinner than I remembered. Thin, in a way that 12 days of whatever he'd been eating in the woods would explain. His face had a particular color, not pale, more like the flushed, slightly mottled color of someone running a sustained fever. He was wearing the same work jacket he'd had when I last saw him in September, but it had a tear along the left forearm, and underneath that tear, the skin was visible, and the skin was not right. It was a dark discoloration, not fresh, more like a bruise that had gone deep and wasn't resolving. It covered maybe a 4-inch section of his forearm, and the edges of it were sharper than a bruise should be. He stopped about 15 feet from the fence. He looked at me. His eyes were clear. I mean that specifically. There was recognition in them, and attention, and something that looked very much like shame. He said, "I didn't turn, just that." I said, "I can see that." He said, "Something bit me, on day 2, before I got out of my house. One of those things had come in through the back door while I was trying to find my car keys." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words carefully. I packed my arm in ice from the freezer. I don't know why I did that. I just did. And I drove to the edge of your property and parked in the trees and waited to turn. Because I figured that was what happened. He looked at his arm. But I didn't. Not all the way. Nora stepped up to the fence. She said, calm, professional. "Can I look at it?" He came closer. He rolled the jacket sleeve back. The discoloration was what I'd seen, but at closer range it had texture. The edges were raised slightly, not uniform, more like a scar that was still forming. The center of it, directly over where I assumed the bite had been, was darker, almost the color of a healing burn. And along the outermost edge of the discoloration, just barely visible if you looked at the angle right, were small, irregular, pale markings, like the edge of something that had tried to spread and been stopped. Nora looked at it for a long time. Her face gave nothing away. She asked him a series of questions in a methodical order. When did you eat last? Are you sleeping? Any difficulty breathing? Any loss of sensation in that arm or hand? Any changes in your vision or hearing? Any compulsive movement toward sounds? Any loss of memory? Any intervals you can't account for? Ray answered all of it. He ate yesterday. Something from a garden he'd found at a house a half-mile from here. Vegetables and some canned goods from the pantry. He was sleeping. His breathing was fine. The arm had some numbness at the bite site, but full function otherwise. Vision fine. Hearing actually sharper than normal, which he mentioned with a kind of uncomfortable specificity, like it was a symptom he'd been cataloging. No compulsive response to sounds. Clear memory. No gaps. Nora turned to me. Her face was still professional. She said, I need to examine him more thoroughly, and I can't do it through a fence. I looked at Ray. I said, Are you ready to come through the gate? He said, Only if you're sure. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. I thought about the behavioral model I'd built for the infected. I thought about the 12 days he'd been in those trees, surviving, making deliberate choices, writing notes with a shaky hand. I thought about the word he'd used, not all the way. I said, I'm sure, and I opened the gate. He came through. We walked him to the barn, not the house or shelter, which was the right call, and Ray understood it without being told. He sat on a hay bale, and Nora examined him for about an hour, while I monitored the radio from the barn. Craig came out with Bert after about 20 minutes. Bert went straight to Ray and put his head in Ray's lap, and Ray put his hand on the dog's head and didn't say anything for a while. What Nora told us afterward, in private, was this. She didn't know what to make of the wound. The discoloration was consistent with a bite injury that had undergone partial infection and then stopped. She'd never seen anything like it in her career. The bite site was not fully healed, but it was not actively spreading. Whatever process the bite normally initiated had started in Ray, and then, for reasons she couldn't determine, plateaued. He was not infected in the way she'd seen at the rest stop. He was not uninfected in the clean way the rest of us were. He was something in the middle that she'd never read about and didn't have a framework for. She said, with a directness that I appreciated, I don't know if this is permanent. I don't know if it can progress. I want to monitor him daily. I want blood pressure, temperature, any changes in the arm. I want to know immediately if anything shifts. Then she said, he stays in the barn until I'm comfortable with a longer timeline. Not because I think he's a threat, because I need data before I can make a judgment. I agreed. Ray agreed when we told him, with a relief in his face that said he'd been prepared for something much harsher. That's how Ray Holcomb joined us. 6 people now, 1 child, 1 dog, 1 situation nobody had a protocol for. Day 14, full day of work. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what daily life actually looks like at this point. Because I've been focused on the incidents and the planning, and I haven't given enough time to the texture of what 14 days inside a fence at the end of the world actually feels like. The morning starts the same way every day. I'm up at 4 a.m. for radio. Craig makes coffee on the camp stove with whatever we have. Helen does a food inventory check that takes about 20 minutes, and from which she produces a daily allocation that she writes on a small chalkboard in the shelter kitchen. The allocation is always enough. Not comfortable, not like a normal meal, but enough. She's managed the numbers well. Nora does her rounds, everyone's temperature, a quick visual check of anyone with existing health concerns, Janice's glucose, Ray's arm, a few minutes of conversation with Dennis that I think is as much therapeutic as medical. The boy is fine, objectively, but 9 years old and separated from his parents in an apocalypse is a situation with a long emotional tail that Nora seems to be keeping an eye on, with the same quiet attention she gives everything. Days are split between maintenance work, monitoring, and whatever specific project is current. Right now the current projects are fortifying the second section of the east fence, where Craig has identified a weak vertical post, extending the hydroponic bay to a second growing rack I found in the barn storage that I'd bought years ago and never assembled, and building a system to track our water consumption rate more precisely so I can project forward. The monitoring is continuous on the radio. We've developed a rotation for it. Everyone who can understand what they're hearing takes a shift. I've trained them on the basics of what to listen for and how to log it. Nora is good at this. Helen is surprisingly good. Craig struggles with the radio discipline side of it, the patience of sitting and doing nothing but listening. But he compensates by being thorough in his logs when something does come through. Evenings are the part that has developed its own shape in a way I didn't design for. After the dinner allocation and the planning meeting, there's usually 2 or 3 hours before sleep, where people settle into the shelter's main room and do their own thing. Craig works on whatever he's building. Janice reads to Dennis. Helen and Nora sometimes talk in a quiet, easy way that tells me they've found common ground in something. I'm not entirely sure what. Ray, in the barn, has started doing something I noticed on day 13 when I went to check on him in the evening. He was writing. I didn't ask what. You don't ask what someone's writing when they've been alone in a forest for almost 2 weeks. I monitor. That's what I do in the evenings. And I think. And I record these things. Day 15. The tone signal is changing. The VHF tone signal I first detected on day 11 has been running continuously, and I've been recording and analyzing it. Here's what I know about it now. It's broadcasting on a single frequency with a consistent pattern, a sequence of tones that repeats every 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The pattern is not random. There's structure in it. Certain tone frequencies appear more often than others, and certain combinations never appear, which is what you'd expect if the pattern was encoding something rather than just cycling randomly. It's a code of some kind, not Morse, not any digital protocol I recognize, something proprietary. The signal strength hasn't changed, which means the source isn't moving and hasn't been damaged. Whatever antenna is broadcasting it, it's stable and powered. What changed on day 15 is the direction. My directional antenna setup isn't precision equipment, but it's good enough to give me a bearing within maybe 10 or 15 degrees. The signal has been coming from roughly northeast since I first detected it. Today, for about 90 minutes in the afternoon, it shifted, not dramatically, maybe 20 degrees east of where it was. Then it came back. A directional change in a fixed transmitter can mean a few things. The source moved, which seems unlikely for what appears to be a fixed installation. The propagation path changed due to atmospheric conditions, which can happen, especially with lower frequency signals. Or the signal is being reflected off something that moved, a vehicle, a large structure, something that acts as a signal bounce surface. I don't have a clean explanation. I flagged the time and the degree of shift and put it in the notebook. The thing that bothers me is not the signal itself. It's the timing. The signal started on day 11, 10 days after the outbreak began. Not during the chaos of the first days. After. Something activated this transmitter after the initial period. That's a deliberate action, not a residual artifact of infrastructure that was already running. Day 15 continued. Janice's blood glucose is trending in a direction Nora doesn't love. Not dangerously, but the medication management without regular testing was slightly off, and the glucose strips from the pharmacy run let us see that. Nora adjusted the timing of Janice's medication based on the readings. Janice took the adjustment without drama and went back to her book. Dennis asked me today what the tone signal was. He'd been sitting near the radio while I was analyzing it, and had apparently been listening for a while before he said anything. I told him I didn't know yet. He said, "It sounds like someone counting, but in a language nobody taught me." I sat with that for a while. It's not a bad description. Day 16. Aldermere. I've been watching for radio traffic about the grocery store since my reconnaissance, and I got something today from a source I hadn't expected. One of the amateur radio operators I've been tracking, a guy who goes by the call sign KB3WRT, and who broadcasts from what I think is a farmhouse somewhere north of the city, mentioned in his daily information roundup that there had been a confrontation at the store on County Road 7 that had resulted in gunfire the previous day. He didn't give details beyond that. He said one person was hurt, but he didn't know who. He said the group at the store was not friendly to new faces, and he'd been told by a source he trusted that they'd expanded their vehicle perimeter. That tells me two things. First, The group at Aldermere is becoming more aggressive as resources become more contested. Second, they have a vehicle perimeter now, which means they're actively thinking about defense, which means they're also actively thinking about threats to their position. We need to either get to Aldermere before it becomes a fortified position we can't access, or find an alternative food source. Or both. I spent the afternoon developing an alternative. On the topographic maps I have, there are 2 farms within 7 miles of our property that are large enough to have serious cold storage and likely significant preserved food stocks. One is a dairy operation. Dairy farms often have industrial quantities of dry goods and feed in their storage facilities. And the dairy products themselves, while probably not viable at this point without power to the cold storage, aren't the only thing in those buildings. The other is a row crop operation that also has a farmhouse that's been in the same family for at least 3 generations, which in my experience means the house has a substantial pantry and possibly a root cellar. The dairy farm is closer, 5 miles. I put it on the planning list for day 17 or 18. Day 16, evening. Ray has been officially moved from the barn to the shelter. This was Nora's decision, made after 5 days of daily monitoring. The arm has not changed. Temperature has been consistent, running about a degree above normal, which Nora says might just be his baseline at this point, and no other symptoms have developed or worsened. He's eating well. He sleeps a lot, more than normal, which Nora says she can't determine is a symptom or just the aftermath of 12 days of outdoor survival. He told me something last night, after the others had gone to sleep, when it was just the 2 of us in the main room, and the radio was running low traffic. He said that on day 2, when he was bitten and packing his arm in ice and waiting to turn, he'd made a decision. He'd driven to the tree line at the edge of my property because he knew about the shelter. He'd always known about it, and he'd wanted to be close to people when whatever happened to him happened. He didn't plan to come in and expose the group. He was going to stay outside the fence. He said, I figured if I turned out there, at least I'd be near something that was still okay. Does that make any sense? I said yes. He said, and then I didn't turn, and I didn't know what to do with that. Because I was supposed to turn, and I didn't, and I couldn't figure out if that was good or if it meant something was wrong that was going to get worse. I asked him if he thought it was going to get worse. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I don't know, but I feel different than I did before. I can hear things, far away things. I shouldn't be able to hear that far. He paused. Is that bad? I said I didn't know. I said Nora would want to know that, and I'd tell her in the morning. He nodded. I stayed on the radio for another 2 hours after that, and I kept thinking about what he'd said. I can hear things, far away things. That's not a normal observation for someone recovering from a bite wound. That's something else. In the notebook, Ray Holcomb, partial exposure, not progressing, possible sensory changes, unknown. Day 17, the dairy farm run. Craig came on this one. His ankle was fully functional, and I wanted someone with mechanical and farm experience to help identify what was worth taking from an agricultural operation. We planned the route the night before, overland for the first 2 miles, using a dirt track I'd located on the topo maps, then a half-mile on a secondary road, then farm lane access. No main roads, no exposure to anything with significant zombie traffic. We left at 6 a.m. in Craig's truck, which we'd been keeping mechanically sound. Oil changed, tire pressure correct, belts checked. Because a vehicle breakdown on a rural road at this stage of the situation is not a problem you can walk away from easily. The overland portion of the route took longer than I'd planned, because one section of the dirt track was soft from recent rain, and the truck sank briefly. Nothing we couldn't drive out of, but it cost us 7 minutes and got my heart rate up in a way I didn't love. We came out on the secondary road and immediately saw a group of 3 infected walking the road surface about 200 yards ahead of us. We stopped, cut the engine, and waited. They moved off the road to the right in response to some sound from the field. Something in the trees, wind maybe. And we gave it 4 minutes, and then drove past the spot where they'd been at a walking pace, with the windows down, so I could hear if anything was close. Nothing. We got to the farm lane. The dairy farm. I'm not going to name it, just in case. was unoccupied and appeared to have been abandoned on about day 2 or 3, based on the state of things. The cows were gone, which initially didn't make sense to me, until Craig pointed out a broken section of the pasture fence and said they'd probably gotten out in the first day or two when nobody came to feed them. No bodies, human or animal, visible anywhere on the property. Whatever happened here, it happened fast, and the people left. The farmhouse had a proper root cellar, as I'd hoped, and the root cellar had 200 pounds of canning in glass jars, potatoes, cured onions, a significant amount of dried beans in cloth bags, hard squash that was still good, preserved meats in vacuum-sealed packaging from what looked like a home butchering operation, and 3 cases of commercial canned goods stacked in a corner that the family had apparently bought as supplementary stock. The pantry and the kitchen proper had flour, sugar, salt, baking soda, multiple grades of oil, vinegar, dried pasta, rice, and, this was the one that actually made me stop and look at it for a second, a hand-cranked grain mill bolted to the kitchen counter that had been there long enough to have worn a groove in the floor from use. We took everything movable. The grain mill Craig unbolted from the counter with a wrench from the truck's toolkit, which took 15 minutes and which I stood watch for the whole time, but it was worth it. A grain mill means the seed stock we took from the feed store can eventually become actual food, not just potential. The farm outbuildings had fuel. The main farm tank was empty. Diesel. The farm ran diesel equipment, and diesel had probably been siphoned in the first few days by someone with a truck. But in the machinery barn, there were 3 5-gallon cans that had been filled and placed under a workbench, ready for small equipment, and nobody had found them. 15 gallons of diesel. I filled the truck's auxiliary tank and put the rest in our reserve cans. We were loading the last of the root cellar food when Craig said, quietly, "There's someone in the barn." He'd seen it from the corner of his eye. Movement in the gap between the barn door and the wall. Not the infectious kind of movement. Something that was trying to stay still and hadn't quite managed it. We put the boxes down and I said clearly, toward the barn, "We're not here to cause problems. We're just taking food. We'll be gone in a few minutes." Long pause. Then, "If you're in there, you can come out. We're not a threat." The barn door opened. What came out was a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, male, in clothes that had been slept in for a week. He was holding a garden shovel in both hands, the way you hold a weapon when a shovel is the best weapon you have. His face had the specific expression of someone who has been running on adrenaline for so long that they've forgotten what normal feels like. He said, "Who are you?" I told him. I said our property was about 5 miles that direction. I said we had supplies and people and a secure location. I said he could come with us if he wanted to, or he could stay, and either way we weren't taking anything he couldn't spare. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Craig, who has the kind of face that people trust immediately, which is a useful quality. Then the teenager said, "I can't stay here. I've been here 3 days and there's nothing left to eat and He stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something. Then he said, "I was with a group at the grocery store on County Road 7. I left." He didn't say why he'd left. The way he said "I left" was not the way you say it when leaving was your choice. His name was Pete Alderman, which Craig noticed because he'd known Pete's grandfather before the old man died, and he said so, and Pete's face went through something complicated that I didn't press on. We brought Pete back. He sat in the truck bed on the way home, surrounded by boxes of food, and held the garden shovel in his lap for the entire drive, and didn't say much. At the gate, he got out and looked at the setup, the fence, the cameras, the antenna on the barn, and he said, "Holy shit," with a kind of reverence that I found oddly satisfying. 7 people now. 1 9-year-old, 1 dog, 1 unknown situation with Ray. When we'd unloaded and Pete had eaten 2 helpings of whatever Helen had put together, and was sitting in the shelter's main room looking more human than he had at the farm, Nora sat across from him and asked him calmly about the grocery store group. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "There are about a dozen of them. They've got guns. The guy running it, his name's Darren. He was some kind of manager before. He managed a distribution center. He runs the store like it's still a business. He decides who eats and who doesn't." Another pause. I was useful to them because I can fix engines. But after a while, being useful stopped being enough. He looked at his hands. Some of the others. There are people there who didn't come voluntarily. There are people there who came to the store for food and couldn't leave. That last sentence landed in the room, and nobody said anything for a while. Nora said, "How many?" Pete said, "At least 3 that I know of. There might be more." I wrote that in the notebook. I don't have a plan yet for what to do about it, but I wrote it down. Day 18. What Ray heard. I told Nora what Ray had said about his hearing. I'd been sitting on it overnight, which I shouldn't have. She went to him immediately and did a full assessment. What she determined: his hearing acuity genuinely appears to have changed. He could hear, consistently and accurately, sounds from distances that she tested, with a tone she made at measured distances. His sensitivity was roughly 3 to 4 times normal in the mid-frequency range. Not superhuman, not dramatic, but definitively beyond what it should be for a 60-something man who spent decades as a mail carrier in loud weather conditions. It was as if the normal dulling of hearing that comes with age had been reversed, or as if something in his auditory processing had been sharpened. The arm discoloration had not spread. The edges were still the same. The center was still the same. But Ray said, and this was the part that Nora came to me specifically to discuss, that sometimes, at night, the arm felt warm, not the warmth of inflammation or infection. He described it as feeling like something was moving in it, below the skin. His words. Nora said she didn't have a diagnostic framework for what she was seeing. She said she could document it, she could monitor it, she could manage any symptoms that emerged. She could not explain it. She said the honest thing, which was, she wasn't certain this was stable. She wasn't certain it was going to progress negatively either. It was simply unknown. She also said, and this is the part she seemed most uncomfortable saying, "I want to note something. When Ray is in the room, when Bert is reacting to something outside, when Bert alerts to something, Ray sometimes looks up or turns in the same direction before I can hear or see anything, before Bert even moves. He's orienting to something." She paused. I don't know what to do with that. I don't either. Day 18 afternoon. Pete started earning his place. I'd asked him what his mechanical background was, and he said his grandfather had run a machine shop and he'd grown up in it. He spent the afternoon with Craig in the barn, going over both trucks with a thoroughness that Craig said afterward was better than he'd expected. They identified a slow fuel leak in Craig's truck that was unrelated to anything recent, a battery that was borderline in my truck that I hadn't noticed, and a wiring issue in my truck's electrical system that Pete found by feel. He said the insulation on one of the cab wiring harnesses had a soft spot that was going to eventually short if it got hot enough. He fixed it with materials from Craig's toolbox and a length of electrical tape from my supply, and charged nothing but dinner. I told him he could stay as long as he wanted. He said, "I know you didn't even consider sending me back." He wasn't wrong. Day 19. The second supply run goes wrong. I had planned to do a pharmaceutical and medical supply run to a small urgent care clinic about 8 miles north that I'd identified on the map as a possible source of things Nora needed. Medical supplies were the gap in our inventory now that we had food reasonably stable for the short term. I took Pete as backup. He knew the roads and he'd proven he was level-headed. We planned the route, the timing, the abort conditions. We left at 8 a.m. The first 3 miles were clean. The roads this far out were quiet. A few abandoned vehicles. No infected visible. Nothing moving that I could see. Then we got to the junction at Route 9, and the situation changed. There were infected on the road, not a few. A significant number. I didn't count. It happened too fast. But at least 30, maybe more, strung along both shoulders of the road and across the center line in a way that would require navigating between them. They were all moving in the same general direction, south, which was consistent with them following some previous sound source. They weren't clustered. They were distributed across maybe a 200-yard stretch of road. I slowed the truck to almost nothing when I saw them from the hill, and we sat there for a moment assessing. Pete said, "If we go slow and don't rev the engine, they might not react to us." I said, "Might. And then I looked at the distribution of infected more carefully, and I noticed something. 2 of them, near the far edge of the group, were walking together in a way that was different from the general drift. Not side by side, the way I'd seen in Radio Rita's account from the city. That shoulder-to-shoulder arrangement that didn't fit my behavioral model. More like they were on the same heading at the same pace, in a way that looked, from a distance, almost like they were walking together on purpose. I put the truck in reverse and backed up over the hill. I said, "We're taking the county road bypass." I pulled out the map and showed Pete the alternate route. It added about 4 miles and took us within a mile of Aldermere, but it avoided Route 9 entirely. He said, "That goes near the store." I said, "We'll keep moving. We're not stopping there." We went the long way. The urgent care clinic was intact, unlocked. The staff had fled and left the place with the alarm, not even armed, which made entry straightforward. Nora's full list was there. More than her list, actually. They had IV supplies in sealed packaging, a portable ultrasound machine that I knew Nora had been wishing for since she arrived, surgical tools, a case of sterile saline bags, and in the break room refrigerator, which was still cold from residual insulation, a 6-pack of orange juice that we drank standing in the parking lot because we could. The return trip was where it went wrong. We were on the county bypass, about 2 miles from home, when Pete pointed ahead and said, "Stop." I stopped. Ahead of us, pulled across the road at an angle that blocked both lanes, was one of the trucks I'd seen at Aldermere. Black pickup. The angle was deliberate. It was a roadblock, not an abandoned vehicle. And standing beside it were 2 men. They'd heard us coming. Obviously, this wasn't a coincidence. One of them walked toward us. He was maybe 40, short hair, wearing a jacket with the kind of logo on it that says, "Regional Chain Store Employee." He stopped about 10 feet from my front bumper, and he looked at the truck, assessed it, its load visible in the bed, and then he looked at me through the windshield, and he raised one hand. Not a wave, a stop signal. I looked at Pete. Pete's face said he recognized the man but was not happy about it. The man came to my window. I lowered it 3 inches. He said, "Where are you coming from?" I said, "Passing through." He said, "That's a full truck bed." I said, "Yes." He said, "We've been having trouble with people taking from the store. You wouldn't know anything about that." I said, "We haven't been near your store," which was technically true. He looked at Pete. He said, "Pete," like a name, said flat, no question in it. Pete said, "Hey, Tyler." There was a pause that had a lot of previous history in it. Then Tyler looked back at me and said, "Darren wants to take a look at what you've got. It's just a standard check. We're doing it with everyone in the area." I said, "That's not going to happen." His face went through something. He said, "We've got 3 vehicles and 12 people, friend." I said, "I know how many vehicles you have. I know where your store is. I know you've added a vehicle perimeter." I let that land for a second. "I also know you haven't got anyone out here with a better equipment position than we have. And you know that, or you would have approached differently." I wasn't bluffing about the equipment position. I was bluffing about the confidence with which I'd assessed his. But sometimes the bluff is load-bearing. Tyler stood there for a while. He looked at Pete again. He said, "You should come back, Darren." Pete said, "No, just the one word." Tyler stepped back from the window. He didn't go back to the roadblock truck right away. He stood in the road and watched us. I put the truck in gear and went around the roadblock on the road's shoulder, slow enough to show I wasn't panicking, and drove home. My hands were completely steady the entire time. I noticed that afterward, in the driveway, my hands were steady. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Back at the shelter, I gave the full account at the evening meeting. The room was quiet when I finished. Craig said, "They're going to come here eventually." I said, "Probably." He said, "So we need to be ready when they do." Pete said, "Darren's not irrational. He's not a good person, but he's not irrational. If you can show him there's a better arrangement than conflict, he might take it." He paused. "Or he might not. I don't know anymore." I filed that away. Not immediately useful, but I keep everything, because sometimes things become useful later. Day 20. The tone signal and what Dennis figured out. I need to tell this story in the right order. I've been working on decoding the tone signal for 9 days. I have a notebook with the full pattern transcribed in every detail I can extract from my spectrum analyzer recordings. I've tried multiple standard encoding approaches, Morse equivalence, numeric substitution, positional codes, various government emergency protocol formats I've researched over the years. Nothing has produced coherent output. Dennis came and sat with me while I was working on it. This was normal by now. He often sat near the radio equipment in the mornings, watching without being asked to leave. He looked at my notebook where I had the pattern written out, and he said, "Can I see it?" I gave him the notebook. He looked at it for a long time. He traced his finger along the rows of tone notations. He said, "These ones are always together," pointing to a specific pair of tone frequencies that I'd also noted appeared as a frequent cluster. "And these ones never happen after those ones," pointing to a different pair. I said, "Yeah, I'd noticed that." He said, "In that book, Grandma reads me, the one about the code breakers in the war. They said the first thing you look for is the word that appears the most, because some words are just more common." He handed me the notebook back. "What's the most common short sequence in here?" I looked. I'd done a frequency analysis, but I'd been looking for longer sequences. When I counted the short ones, 2 and 3 element patterns, there was one clear winner. A 2-tone sequence that appeared at the beginning of the pattern, at the middle, and at the end, every cycle. If it was functioning as punctuation, separating segments of information the way a paragraph break works, and if the information in between those breaks was variable, while the breaks themselves were fixed, then the whole pattern was potentially 3 distinct chunks of information repeated in sequence. I stared at the notebook for a while. Then I looked at Dennis and said, "That's a good thought." He said, "I know," with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 9-year-old who gives himself appropriate credit. I spent the next 4 hours working the new approach. 3 segments, separated by that repeating 2-tone anchor. Within each segment, I applied a positional code. Each tone cluster assigned a number based on its frequency, and those numbers read as a standard alphabetic substitution. It didn't work perfectly, but it almost worked. Enough of it resolved into something that looked like it might be letters that I stayed with it. By 10 p.m. I had a partial decode. 2 of the 3 segments resolved into something readable. The third was still garbled, and I don't know if that's because my analysis is still off, or because that segment uses a different key. The 2 segments that resolved. First segment, Sector 7 active, maintain position, await extraction order. Second segment, Civilian Contact Protocol 7, do not engage hostile, report coordinates. I sat with that for a long time. Sector 7, someone divided this region into sectors. Sector 7 is active, and someone is maintaining position in it and waiting for an extraction order. That's military or paramilitary language. That's organized. That's a plan in motion. Civilian Contact Protocol 7. There's a protocol for contact with civilians, and it's numbered, which means there are at least 6 other protocols, which means this organization has thought carefully about how to manage civilian populations in this scenario. Someone has a plan that was made before day 11 when this signal activated, probably before day 1 when the outbreak started, given how organized the language is. I didn't sleep that night. Day 21. What Nora told me. She came to me after dinner, when the others had settled into their evening routines, and she said she needed to tell me something. The way she said it had weight in it, not the careful professional weight she uses when she has medical information to deliver. Something different. Personal weight. We sat in the corner of the main room where I keep the radio equipment. Low lamp running. Everyone else at the other end of the shelter or in the barn. She looked at the floor for a second and then at me. She said, "At the rest stop, on day 2, before I got the ambulance locked, before my partner." She stopped, took a breath, which is a thing I've seen Nora do exactly twice, and it means she's managing something significant. My arm got scratched, by one of them, not a bite. A fingernail scratch, about 2 inches, on my forearm. I cleaned it immediately with the medical kit in the ambulance. I've monitored it every day since. She paused. There's nothing there. No discoloration. No spread. No symptoms of any kind. And she looked at me. I said, "How long have you known about this?" She said, "Since day 2. I said, "And you've been watching Ray's arm every day since he arrived?" She said, "Yes." I thought about that. About what it meant to be a medically trained person sitting across from another person's potentially infected wound and giving them careful daily assessments while carrying your own silent comparison point. I said, "What do you think the scratch means?" She said, "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Scratch versus bite might be the relevant variable. Or maybe Ray's partial conversion is a function of his specific biology, and I'm just clean. Or," she stopped again, "or it means something about exposure that I can't characterize yet." I said, "Does anyone else know?" She said no. I said, "Do you want them to know?" She thought about that. Then she said, "I think Craig and Helen should know. They're the longest-standing members of this group, and they're going to be involved in every significant decision we make. I don't want them making decisions without information I have." She paused. "I don't think Pete needs to know right now, and I was going to leave it to you what to say to Janice and Dennis. I said I'd think about how to handle those two. I said we'd tell Craig and Helen together, tomorrow." She said, "Are you?" She started, and then didn't finish the question. I said, "You managed to monitor Ray's arm daily for 5 days while carrying your own private version of the same situation, and you just told me voluntarily, because you thought the group deserved the information. I'm not going to respond to that with anything except exactly that. You handled it, and you told us, and that's the right call." She didn't say anything. After a moment, she nodded and went to her sleeping area. I stayed at the radio for another 2 hours. I was thinking about a lot of things. The decoded signal, Nora's forearm, Ray's hearing, the standing row of infected I'd heard about on day 9 and hadn't been able to explain. And something else, something I hadn't said out loud yet. The signal said civilian contact protocol. It said report coordinates. If there is an organized military or paramilitary group operating in this region, maintaining a transmitter, waiting for an extraction order, monitoring for civilian populations, then there may be a moment where contact with that group is possible. Or necessary. And I don't know yet if that's a good thing or a bad thing. The existence of an organized plan doesn't mean the plan is beneficial to the people caught inside it. Someone planned this. That's not automatically reassuring. Day 22. Morning. 2 things to record before I start on the day's work. First, I left a detailed note at the southeast fence post last night. Not for Ray. Ray's inside now. I left it for whoever comes to that spot if someone else does. Which might not happen, but I wanted to be sure. The note is brief, says who we are and that we're not hostile, and gives my radio frequency for anyone who can receive it. I also left, just to close this thread completely, 1 more bottle of water. For anyone who finds themselves in the trees on the far side of that fence, alone and scared, and not turning when they should be. Second, we got something on the shortwave this morning at 4 a.m. that I need to process carefully before I share it with the group. A transmission on the frequency I've been monitoring, the government emergency channel where I caught the fragmentary clear voice 30 seconds on day 11. This one was longer, about 45 seconds of clear voice before the encryption resumed. A female voice, not the same as any I'd heard before. Flat, precise, no emotion in it. Containment Assessment Day 22, Eastern Sector. Population density and transit corridors increasing. Primary vector distribution has reached rural classification threshold in 7 counties. Designations Alpha through Foxtrot and then the cipher again. Rural classification threshold, 7 counties. We are in one of those counties. I don't know which designation, but the infected are spreading into rural classifications now, and someone is tracking it systematically, sector by sector, county by county. We've been thinking of ourselves as safe out here, at a distance from the city. The rural nature of this location has been part of the safety calculation since day 1. If the infected population is reaching rural threshold in 7 counties, and this region is among them, then the buffer we've been counting on is not as stable as I thought. I need to revise some timelines. I need to revise some plans. I'm going to tell the group at this morning's meeting. All of it. The decoded signal, the clear text intercept, Nora's situation, Ray's hearing, Pete's information about the prisoners at Aldermere. Everything I've been holding. It's day 22. The first stage of this situation, hunker down, accumulate, understand the threat, is ending. The next stage is starting to take shape whether I'm ready for it or not. Whatever comes next, we go into it with clear information. All of us. That's the only way this works. Day 22, morning meeting. I'm going to describe this meeting in detail because it's the one where everything changed. I laid it out in order. Nora's situation first, because it deserved to be first, and because getting that out set a tone of complete disclosure that I needed the group to feel. Craig listened without expression. Helen put her hand over Nora's once, brief. Craig said, "You've been fine for 22 days. Nora said yes. He said, "Okay." That was the complete reaction, which was exactly the right one. Then, the signal and the decode. I put my notebook on the table and walked them through it. The tone signal, the frequency analysis, what Dennis had seen, the 2 segments I'd decoded. Sector 7 active. Await extraction order. Civilian contact protocol 7. Do not engage hostile. Report coordinates. Pete said, "There's a military unit out there somewhere." I said that was my read. Ray said, "Extraction order. That means they're planning to move people." His voice sounded different when he said it, a kind of interest that was more than casual. I said yes, and then I told them about the clear text intercept from this morning. The rural classification threshold. 7 counties, our county almost certainly among them. The room was quiet for a while. Craig said, "So staying here is still an option, but it's a shrinking one." I said that was accurate. Helen said, "What's the other option?" I said I didn't know yet, but I was thinking about 2 things. First, finding the source of that signal, or at least locating the organization behind it, would give us either a potential ally or a potential threat that we could assess on our terms, rather than someone else's. Second, the Aldermere situation with the people Pete said were being held there was something we couldn't ignore indefinitely. If we were going to be a group that made principled decisions, sitting on that information and doing nothing with it wasn't a decision I could hold. Janice said, from the other end of the table, without looking up from her coffee cup, "When I came through that gate on day 5, I was carrying my grandson and nothing else, and you let me in." She looked up. I'd like to think I'd do the same thing if I was the one with the gate and someone else was on the outside. Nobody said anything to that for a while. Dennis, who had been sitting at the corner of the table in his spot with the radio notebook in front of him, said, "So what are we going to do?" I said, "I'm going to spend today working on a plan, a real one, with options and contingencies. And then I'm going to bring it to this table and we're going to decide together, all of us." I looked at Dennis specifically. All of us. He nodded, satisfied. Went back to the notebook. That's day 22. I'm going to record the plan when it's done. But right now I want to say something into this recorder that isn't about logistics or threat assessment. 22 days ago, I was alone in this shelter. I had built everything below this ground for one person surviving alone, because alone was my model, because I'd always thought that the simplest unit was the most survivable one. I was wrong about that, not about the preparation. The preparation was right, and the preparation has kept everyone in this building alive when a lot of people outside weren't. But alone, the alone part was wrong. Not strategically wrong, human wrong. There's a difference between surviving and existing, and for 9 years I was doing the second thing, and calling it the first one. There are 7 people and a boy and a dog in this shelter. One of them has a bite wound that did something nobody can explain, and ears that hear things they shouldn't. One of them was scratched and might have something in her system or might not, and she told us anyway. One of them has a grandmother who reads to him every night without fail. One of them builds things with scrap metal in the evenings, because it's how he thinks. One of them came out of the woods with a garden shovel and turned out to be the only person in the building who can fix an engine right. This isn't the group I planned for. It's the group that happened. And standing here 22 days in, I think it might be better than the group I planned for. Not because I planned it wrong, because plans don't know what they're missing until the missing things show up. Day 23. The plan. I spent most of yesterday building it, and most of last night checking it, and by this morning, I had something I could put on the table without being embarrassed by it. Not a perfect plan. There's no such thing as a perfect plan when your information base has holes in it the size of the ones I'm working with, but a plan with real options, real contingencies, an honest assessment of what we don't know. Here's the core of it, as I laid it out at the morning meeting. We have 3 problems that are all converging on approximately the same time frame. First, the infected population in this region has reached rural classification threshold, which means the buffer between us and serious exposure is degrading faster than I'd accounted for in my original calculations. We have maybe 2 to 4 weeks before the road situation becomes genuinely unmanageable for vehicle travel. Maybe less. Second, the Aldermere group is expanding and becoming more aggressive. Tyler's roadblock on day 19 was an escalation. Sooner or later, they're going to push further out, and we're going to be in their path. Third, there is an organized military or paramilitary operation in this region, with a signal that's been broadcasting since day 11, and a protocol structure that suggests they're monitoring civilian populations and waiting for an order to move. That operation is either a resource or a threat, and we don't know which, and we're running out of time to find out before we need to know. These 3 problems don't have independent solutions. Trying to solve any one of them without the others in mind creates new vulnerabilities, so the plan treats them as a connected situation. Phase 1, Aldermere. Before we do anything involving movement toward the military signal source, we need to resolve the situation at the grocery store. Not because it's the most strategically pressing issue. It isn't, but because 3 people are apparently being held there against their will, and we're not a group that can know that and drive in the other direction. That's just where we landed when I put the question to the table. I didn't push it. The table came to it on its own. I'm putting that in the record because I think it says something about this group. The Aldermere action is not a raid. We're not going to drive up and start a gunfight with 12 armed people. What we're going to do is more careful than that, and it depends on information that Pete has about the layout and the routines. I'll get to the specifics in the day 26 entry when it happens. Phase 2. Locate and assess the signal source. I've been refining my directional analysis, and I have a bearing that I think is accurate to within 10 degrees, pointing roughly northeast at a distance I estimate at 20 to 40 miles, based on signal strength. That's a wide range, but it's something to work with. The plan involves a careful 2-vehicle reconnaissance toward that bearing, using the topo maps and the overland routes I've been charting. We find the source, we observe it, and then we decide what to do with what we find. Phase 3. Make a decision about the shelter. This one is the hardest. This is the physical place we've been surviving from for 22 days. I built it over 9 years. It has 2,000 gallons of water in the ground, a functional hydroponic bay, solar and wind power, an antenna system, more stored food than we can carry. Walking away from it is not something you do without a very good reason. The radio intercept about rural classification threshold is getting close to a very good reason. I laid all of this out at the table. Craig said, "Tell me the Aldermere part more." So I did. Here's the Aldermere approach, as Pete and I developed it over the previous day. Pete knows the store. He lived and worked inside it for 8 days before he left. He knows the guard rotation, or knew it as of day 17. It may have changed. He knows where the people who are being held are kept. They're in the store's back office area, which has 1 door, and which is apparently where Darren houses anyone he considers a problem or an asset he doesn't trust with freedom of movement. He knows the communication setup. They have 2 CB radios, and one of the trucks has a police scanner, similar to mine but less sophisticated. He knows one significant vulnerability. The generator that powers the store runs on propane, and the propane tank is at the back of the building, outside, accessible from the loading dock, without going through the store at all. We're not going to blow the generator. We're not going to storm the store. Here's what we're going to do. On the night we've designated, day 26, 2 of us go to the store on foot, quiet, along the tree line behind the property. Pete guides because he knows the physical layout. We go to the loading dock. We get to the 3 people being held in the back office through the loading dock entrance, which Pete says has a simple push-bar lock that he used to exit and enter routinely because it was the staff entrance. We tell them we have transport and a location. We take them if they'll come. We leave before anyone in the main store knows we were there. The store group has their resources, and we take nothing from them. No confrontation, no escalation, just the people who want to leave. The risk, we get caught. The mitigation, Craig will be in the truck, a quarter-mile up the road, with the engine warm and the channel monitored. If something goes wrong, we abort and run. The truck is faster than anything in Aldermere's lot, based on what I've seen. Pete said, Darren doesn't post anyone at the loading dock. He posts everyone at the front, because that's where he thinks the threat comes from. He paused. He thinks about defending what he has from people who'd take it. He doesn't think about people who'd take people. Helen said, is that because he doesn't understand the value of people, or because he doesn't care? Pete considered that. He said, both, I think. We finalized the plan. 3 days of preparation, then day 26. Day 23 afternoon. I finally went to look at the thing I'd been told about, the standing row of infected on the eastern edge of Harlow. This was my decision. I didn't tell the group ahead of time, because I knew there'd be an argument about it, and I didn't want to spend energy on the argument. I told Craig I was doing a solo reconnaissance along the eastern approach to the city, and that I'd be back by dark. He gave me a look that said he knew there was more to it than that, and he handed me an extra radio and didn't ask. I drove to within a mile of the city's eastern industrial district, using back roads that I'd mapped. Then I went on foot through a stretch of overgrown industrial land, old warehouses, a former concrete plant, a lot of scrub growth in the chain-link lots, to where the woman on the CB channel had described seeing the row of infected. I found them. Not in the same position. They'd moved, or a different group had assembled there, or, and this is the part that I keep coming back to, the same group had moved and then reassembled in a new position, because what I found wasn't a row exactly, not at this location. It was a cluster, about 20 of them, in a space between 2 industrial buildings, and they were standing still, facing outward, not inward, outward, away from the center of the cluster, like the perimeter of something, rather than a crowd. I got within about 200 feet, behind a chain-link fence with enough visual cover that I wasn't visible to them from where they stood. I watched for about 15 minutes. They were not moving. They were not responding to anything I could detect. Some of them were making sounds. The low, sustained sound that infected make that's not quite a moan and not quite breathing, just a persistent tonal output. But it wasn't directional or responsive to anything around them. The cluster had a center. In the center was nothing. No infected, no objects. Just a clear space about 10 feet across, surrounded by 20-some standing infected facing outward. I cannot explain that configuration. The behavioral model I've built does not produce that result, from individual, non-communicating infected responding independently to stimuli. A group of individuals each responding independently to sounds would cluster, yes, but they'd cluster facing inward toward the shared stimulus, not outward, not in a perimeter. I took pictures with the phone camera I've been keeping powered for exactly this kind of documentation, and I left. On the way back, I passed the spot on Route 9, where I'd seen the group walking south on day 19. The road was empty now, but on the shoulder, in the loose gravel, there was a trail in the dirt. Not footprints exactly, more like a continuous smear that looked like a lot of feet going in the same direction. South. The trail was about 8 feet wide. Something has been herding through here. Not a random drift. Something that moved in a column. I drove home with all the windows up, even though it wasn't cold. Day 24. Ray's ears solve a problem we didn't know we had. I'm going to describe this exactly as it happened, because it's the thing that shifts my understanding of Ray most significantly. We were in the late afternoon, about 4 p.m., with the planning for the Aldermere operation underway, and Nora and Pete doing a walkthrough of the approach route on the paper map, when Ray came in from the barn. He'd been in the barn because he found it easier to sleep there. He'd told me 2 days ago that the shelter's enclosed space made the sound situation uncomfortable for him. He said it was like being in a space where every small sound was doubled. The barn was bigger and quieter, He came in from the barn and stood in the shelter doorway and said, "There's a vehicle on the north road." I said, "How far out?" He said, "Maybe a mile. Diesel engine. It's slowing down." Nobody else had heard anything. I went to the camera monitors and pulled up the North Road camera, which covers the approach from that direction at about 400 yards. Nothing visible yet. I waited. After about 45 seconds, a vehicle appeared on the camera, coming from the north, moving slowly. A truck. Dark-colored. I couldn't identify the make from the camera angle. Ray had heard it at a mile. A diesel truck at a mile, through a barn wall, is not something human hearing should be able to detect. The truck slowed further as it came up our road, then stopped. It sat there for about 3 minutes. Then it turned around and went back north. I went back inside and looked at Ray. He said, "I don't know why I can hear like that. I've stopped trying to figure it out and started trying to use it." "That's the right instinct." I said so. We put Ray on perimeter listening duty from that afternoon forward, not asking him to do anything other than what he was already doing naturally, sitting in the barn with his ears and telling us when something was coming, that the cameras might not catch. A low-tech early warning system that was better than anything I could have engineered because it was built into a person. What I didn't say to Ray then, and am saying now, is that the truck that came up the north road and turned around worried me more than an approaching threat would have. A threat I can deal with. A scout. Someone who came close enough to look and then left. That's information going back somewhere. Someone assessed our position and returned to report. I don't know yet who sent that scout, but I have ideas. Day 24 continued. Nora sat with me in the evening and told me she'd done something. She'd taken one of her own blood samples using the supplies from her medical bag and the urgent care materials we'd retrieved, and she'd done the closest thing she could to a self-assessment without a proper lab. It was limited. Field diagnostics aren't laboratory diagnostics. But she'd looked at it under the portable USB microscope she'd found in the urgent care stock, which was designed for wound assessment but had sufficient magnification for basic cell observation. She said, "I don't see anything abnormal." Then she said, "Which is not the same as there being nothing there. I don't have the equipment to see what I'd need to see to be certain." I said, "But nothing obvious." She said, "Nothing obvious. Day 22 since the scratch." She paused. Ray's bite was day 2. By day 5, his arm was already showing the discoloration. I don't have that. Whatever happened to him, it either didn't happen to me, or it's happening on a much longer timeline, or the scratch was genuinely insufficient exposure. I said, "Which do you think is most likely?" She said, "I think the scratch was insufficient. I think a scratch through intact clothing at the surface of skin, immediately cleaned with betadine and flushed, is different from a full-depth bite with direct tissue contact." She paused again. "I want to believe that. I also can't be completely certain it's true." I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm functional," which is Nora speak for yes, and I took it as that. Day 25. 2 things before day 26. The first. The hydroponic bay completed its second growth cycle today. The expansion rack I assembled 3 weeks ago is producing now, mostly lettuce and some spinach again, with one tray of something that Helen identified from the seed packets as a variety of cherry tomato that was about 2 weeks from producing actual fruit. We ate fresh greens at dinner for the second time, and the reaction to that was disproportionate enough to be funny. Craig ate his share and then sat back with his eyes closed for a second, like he was trying to memorize what fresh food tasted like. Janice said, "If we get tomatoes before we leave this place, I'm going to consider that a spiritual experience." She said it casually enough that I almost missed what was embedded in the sentence. Before we leave this place. She'd already accepted that we would leave. She'd gotten there on her own timeline, without anybody pushing her there. I looked around the table, and I think everyone else had gotten there too, in their own time, without saying it out loud yet. The plan to eventually move wasn't a surprise to anyone. It was just something we hadn't put language to yet. I said, "We're probably not waiting for the tomatoes." Janice said, "I know." She said it without looking disappointed exactly, more like she was filing it away under things that don't work out. The second thing, I finished decoding the third segment of the tone signal. It took me 2 extra days past the first 2 segments, because the third segment used a different key, not a different encoding method, same fundamental structure, but a different substitution table. The table is shifted by a specific number that I worked out by trying every integer from 1 to 26 against the partially resolved output, and finding which shift produced coherent text. The third segment reads, Remote Site Protocol. Beacon assets proceed to extraction point Delta. Grid reference follows. And then a grid reference in military grid reference system format. Latitude and longitude, essentially. Translated into the standard 8-digit MGGARS notation that any military-trained person would read immediately, and that I had to convert using a topo map and a set of coordinate references I'd fortunately included in my prep library. I converted the grid reference. It put the extraction point at a location about 34 miles northeast of our property, in the Appalachian foothills, a specific mountain valley location that, on my topo maps, shows a long, flat area adjacent to a river that would be suitable as a landing zone for rotary aircraft, about 4 miles from a state Forest Service road that would be accessible by vehicle. Extraction point Delta. Beacon assets proceed. Beacon assets. Someone is a beacon asset, possibly the people maintaining the signal, possibly other designated individuals in this region, possibly, and this is the thought that made me sit back from the notebook for a long time, possibly people who were pre-identified before day 1 as assets to be extracted in the event of this specific scenario. I spent an hour after that going through what I know about myself and trying to figure out whether any of it fits the profile of someone who'd be pre-identified as a beacon asset. I'm an electrical engineer, with extensive knowledge of communications infrastructure. I built an off-grid facility that's been operational and monitoring emergency frequencies since day 1 of the event. I intercepted and decoded a signal that was presumably not meant to be easily decoded. That last one gives me pause. If the signal was not easy to decode, and it wasn't, it took me 11 days with engineering expertise and a 9-year-old's insight. Then whoever designed it expected it to filter out unsophisticated receivers. It would only be decoded by someone with the technical capability to do it, which means the information it contains was meant for someone with that capability. I'm not sure that makes me a beacon asset, but I'm not sure it doesn't. I did not decode this signal for anyone but us. I decoded it because it was information in the environment, and I track information the way some people track calories or steps. It's just what I do. I need to understand what's in the space around me. But having decoded it means I now have information about an extraction point that was not meant for general circulation. What I do with that information is the most important decision I've made since I keyed the radio on day 2 and said hello to Nora. I put it in the notebook, and I went to sleep without making the decision. I've found over 22 years of engineering work that the right approach to a problem is often clearest at 4 a.m. on the day after you thought you needed to decide. Day 26. Aldermere. We'd planned this for 3 days, and I want to record it straight, without embellishment, in the order it happened. Pete and I left the property on foot at 11 p.m. Craig was in my truck on the county road, parked off in a field lane with the lights off and the engine idling. One channel on the radio dedicated to us. Nora was at the shelter monitoring. Ray was in the barn. Helen had Dennis. The route to the store from our overland approach was about 2 miles on foot, through fields and the edge of a woodlot, coming out at the back of the property the store sits on. Pete had walked this exact path before. He'd used it to leave, in the other direction, on day 17, which is why he knew it was clear of infected in the immediate area. Things change, so we went cautiously. It took us 40 minutes. The back of the store is loading dock, 4 bays, steel overhead doors, the propane tank in a cage to the right of the last bay. Pete's intel on the guard rotation had them posting at the front only after midnight. It was just past midnight when we came out of the woodlot. The loading dock area was clear. One light over the 3rd bay, a security light that was running off the generator, casting a cone of yellow that stopped about 20 feet out. We stayed outside that cone. Pete went straight to the 4th bay door, which has the staff push bar entry on the right side. He tried it. It opened. Inside, a corridor that smelled like a grocery store's back rooms always smell. cardboard and cold storage and something vaguely chemical. The lights in the corridor were off, but there was light coming from under two doors. One far ahead, which Pete said was the main store area, and one close on the left, which he said was the office. He tried the office door. Locked from the outside, a basic keyed deadbolt. He'd told me this would be the case. I'd brought a specific tool for this, a slip hammer, and a set of lockpicks that I've had in the shelter's kit for years, and that I've practiced with enough to open a basic residential deadbolt in under 2 minutes in good conditions. The conditions were not good. Low light, time pressure, hands that were not entirely steady. But I had the lock in 90 seconds. We opened the door. 3 people inside. A woman who was sitting against the wall who stood up fast when the door opened. A man who was lying on a cot, who sat up slowly like he'd been asleep. A second man who was standing in the corner who didn't move. Pete said, quietly, "It's me. It's Pete. I came back." The standing man in the corner said, "Pete." Just the name. The woman was already moving toward the door. I said, "We have a vehicle, a quarter-mile up the road, and a secure location 5 miles from here. You can come with us. You don't have to. But if you're coming, we need to go in the next 3 minutes." The woman said yes, immediately. The man from the cot, his name turned out to be Gary, I'd learn later, a 40-something former school bus driver who'd come to the store on day 4 for food and never been allowed to leave. Gary said yes, putting on shoes that were sitting next to the cot in a way that suggested they'd been placed there ready to go at some point. Maybe a long time ago. The standing man in the corner said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "There are 2 others. They moved them yesterday. I don't know where." Pete said, "We can't search the whole store." The man in the corner said, "I know." He came toward the door. "Then let's go." We went back down the corridor, through the bay door, into the dark behind the loading dock. We were about 60 feet from the building when the light over the 3rd bay came on, and someone came through that door and yelled. Not a word, just a shout, the kind that means I see something and I'm alerting. I don't know if they heard us, or saw us, or just happened to open that door at the wrong moment for us. It doesn't matter. We ran. Into the dark, toward the woodlot. Behind us, engine sounds. One of the trucks starting. We were in the trees before the headlights came on. In the trees, we were invisible to headlights. The lights swept the field edge and found nothing, and went back to the store. Either they weren't committed enough to follow into the dark, or they decided the loading dock gap was a different kind of security problem and wanted to assess it first. We got to the county road in 20 minutes. Craig was there. All 5 of us got in the truck. Nobody said anything for the whole drive back. At the gate, Helen met us. Ray, from the barn, had heard the truck coming 3 minutes before it arrived and warned Nora, who had the gate already open. Everybody through. Gate closed. The woman's name was Diane Marsh. She was a high school biology teacher, 41 years old, who'd been at the store for 11 days. The man in the corner was a man named Walt Booker, 58, a retired pipe fitter who'd been there for 7 days and who, as it turned out, had been planning his own exit for about 5 of those days. The delay had been logistics. He just needed the right moment. And Gary, the bus driver. Gary sat in the shelter's main room for about 20 minutes after we got back without saying much. Then he said, "I thought nobody was coming." He said it not accusatorially, not with self-pity, just as a statement of fact. I said we almost didn't. He said, "But you did." I said, "Yeah." He looked around the shelter and said, "You built all this." I said, "Over 9 years." "Yeah." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "What do you need me to do?" That was Gary's entry into this group. What do you need me to do? 11 people now. 1 9-year-old, 1 dog. The situation with Ray still unknown. The Aldermere group now knowing we'd been in their building. I didn't sleep. I sat on the radio until dawn. Nothing on the Aldermere channels specifically. They weren't broadcasting. The tone signal was still running. And at 3:47 a.m. the government frequency gave me another 30 seconds of clear text before the cipher resumed. Different voice this time. Male, not the flat professional one I'd heard before. Older, and something in the quality of his speech that suggested exhaustion or stress managed for too long. He said, asset coordination note for Eastern Sector. Extraction point Delta is still viable as of this morning. Repeat, Delta is still viable. Authorization window is currently at, and then cipher. Just the word currently, and then nothing. Authorization window. The extraction has a time limit. And the word currently means the limit is being actively tracked, right now, by someone who was up at 3:47 a.m., monitoring whether the window was still open. I wrote it down. I sat on it until the sun came up. Day 27, the day after Aldermere. Nobody came for us. I'd been watching the North Road camera since dawn, and the road stayed empty all morning. Either the Aldermere group wasn't confident enough in our position to mount a response, or they were taking time to plan one, or, and this was the scenario I found most plausible, they weren't sure it was us. We'd gone in without identification, left no trace. For all Darren knew, the people in that office had escaped on their own, which they might have been capable of eventually, given Walt's independent planning. What came instead of a response was something I hadn't anticipated. At 10 a.m., a CB transmission on the channel I've been monitoring for civilian traffic. A voice I recognized immediately. Tyler, the man from the roadblock on day 19. He said, in a low, careful voice that was nothing like the controlled authority tone he'd used at the truck. This is a message for the property on County Road 9. I know you've got a radio. I need to talk. Not for Darren, for myself. A pause. Darren has 2 more people he's planning to move to a secondary location today, now that he thinks he has a security breach. I don't. Another pause. Longer. I don't agree with what he's doing with people who came in voluntarily. I haven't agreed with it for a while. If you're open to it, I'd like to come to your gate alone, unarmed. I'll tell you what I know. After that, you can decide what to do with it. I sat with that transmission for about 8 minutes. Then I got on the channel. I said, gates on County Road 9, North End. Come before noon. Come alone the way you said, and come on foot. If you come in a vehicle, we'll hear it. I clicked off before he could respond. I told the group. Diane, who had the most recent experience with Tyler, said he'd always been uncomfortable with the way Darren ran things. She said he'd done his job at the front of the store, but she'd seen him look away from things he should have said something about, which she read as conflict rather than agreement. Walt said he didn't know enough about the guy to have an opinion. Gary said, let him come. Worst case, he's a scout, and we learned something from talking to him. Best case, he's a genuine break. Pete said nothing. I looked at him. He shrugged. He said, Tyler and I grew up in the same town. He's not a bad person. He's just the kind of person who picks the wrong team and stays loyal out of habit. Then he said, that's not a reason to trust him. It's just context. Tyler came at 11:30, on foot as agreed, and he came up the road in the open, where the camera would have him the whole approach. No jacket, which was cold but which was his way of making it obvious he wasn't armed or layered. At the gate, Craig stood beside me. Ray was in the barn with his ears on the road behind Tyler. Nora was inside monitoring. Tyler came to the gate and looked at us. He looked at the setup, the cameras, the fence, the antenna, and I could see him recalibrating the way Nora had when she arrived, adding up what he was seeing against what he'd expected. He said, you were the ones last night. I said, what do you need to tell us? He took a breath. He said, Darren's got 2 more people in the secondary location. A woman named Pat, mid-60s, came in on day 8. She's got a medical condition, and he's been using her medication as leverage because she can't get more. And a teenager, a girl, 16, came in on day 14. She's not. He stopped. He looked at the ground for a second. When he looked up, he said, she's not in a good situation. He told us the secondary location, a storage unit facility about 2 miles from the store that Darren had been using since day 10 as an overflow space. It had a generator. It had an exterior lock. 2 people guarding it overnight, rotating. I said, why are you telling us this? He said, because I watched you drive that truck around my roadblock, and I saw the look on Pete's face, and I realized. He paused. I realized I'd been standing at a front door being a deterrent for 2 weeks, while things happened behind me that I knew about and did nothing about, and you went in through the back, and took 3 people out, and Darren came to me this morning and said we had to move the others, and I thought—" He stopped again. Craig said, quietly, "You thought it was time to be on the right side?" Tyler looked at Craig. He said, "Yeah." I looked at Craig. Craig gave me a small nod. Not enthusiastic, just, yes. I opened the gate. Tyler stood in the gap for a second, like he wasn't sure he'd heard it right. Then he came through. Day 27 into the afternoon, Tyler gave us the full layout of the storage facility. He drew it from memory on the back of one of my map sheets. 2 buildings, 1 active exterior padlock, single generator on the south side. The 2 guards were people he knew by name. One he thought might go along if the situation was explained clearly. One he wasn't sure about. We planned it for that night. Simpler than Aldermere. We knew the layout. We had inside information. And if Tyler was willing to be visible in the approach, it changed the calculus of the guard's response significantly. Pete modified one of the handheld radios with a modified squelch setting that would let Tyler hear us, even if he keyed transmit without speaking, just pressing the button as a signal. Nora restocked the medical bag for 2 additional patients with unknown conditions. Craig went over the truck. That night, day 27 going to 28, Tyler, Pete, and I went to the storage facility. Tyler walked to the front and spoke to one of the guards, the one he thought was reachable. And I'm not going to reproduce the conversation, but I'll say it took about 4 minutes and involved Tyler being very clear about what was happening at the store, in a way that, from what Pete relayed to me afterward, the guard had been half expecting to hear for a while. The guard stepped aside. The second guard around the back didn't step aside. He raised his voice. I stepped out of the shadow with a specific item in my hands that has never needed to be used in this account, and that I'd prefer not to need to describe, and he looked at it, and he stepped aside too. The storage unit, Pat, the woman with the medical condition, was okay. Thin, tired, not medically compromised beyond what her existing condition was doing to her. The girl was named Abby. She was 16. She had a specific way of holding herself when she stood up that told me she'd been having to make herself smaller, and when Nora stepped in front of her and said, "We're not with them. We're going to take you out of here," Abby looked at Nora with an expression I've replayed in my head several times since, and am going to stop trying to put words to. They both came. The second guard came too in the end. He said he didn't want to go back to the store. I said he could come with us for now, and we'd figure out the arrangement, and he nodded and got in the truck bed without being asked. Back at the property by 1:30 a.m. 14 people. 1 9-year-old, 1 dog, and 1 teenager who ate 3 servings of rice and beans and then fell asleep sitting up at the table before Helen gently guided her to a cot. In the morning I counted heads and thought, this is not the group I built this shelter for. That's the point. Day 28. Pat. Pat's full name was Patricia Hollowell. She was 64, a retired pharmacist. When she heard what Nora was doing with the medical supplies and heard me describe what I'd decoded from the tone signal, she sat down at the table and said, "I need to tell you something." She'd been at the Aldermere store since day 8, but before that, in the first 7 days, she'd been somewhere else, at the eastern edge of the city, in a neighborhood that backed up against the industrial corridor where I'd seen the cluster of infected. She said she'd seen things that she hadn't told anyone at Aldermere, because she didn't know how to explain them without people thinking she'd lost her mind. She'd seen infected individuals that weren't moving randomly. She'd seen them in configurations, not just the standing cluster I'd described in my Day 23 notes, which I hadn't told her about yet, but other configurations. Lines, loose columns, things that looked, at a distance, like directed movement, like they were going somewhere specific and not just following the nearest sound. She said they were moving away from the city center, toward the east, in a shape that wasn't just drift. I told her about the boot-wide smear trail on the Route 9 shoulder, about the cluster facing outward with the empty center space. She listened with the particular attention of someone who's been sitting on information they didn't know anyone else had. Then she said something that I've been turning over ever since. She said, "I was a pharmacist for 31 years. The one thing I kept thinking, watching those configurations, was about certain parasitic infections. There are organisms, toxoplasma, certain fungal infections, a few others, that modify host behavior. They make the host do things that serve the organism's life cycle rather than the host's interests. They don't make the host smart. They just hijack certain basic movement and aggregation responses. What I was watching, it didn't look like intelligence. It looked like programming. I said, "What would that mean for the outbreak?" She said, "It would mean something is using these people, not controlling them in any sophisticated way, just influencing their large-scale movement and positioning in a way that serves some function we don't understand yet." She paused. "I don't know if that's what's happening. I'm a pharmacist, not an epidemiologist, but I know what purposeful movement looks like, and I know what random drift looks like, and what I was seeing was closer to the first." I added that to the notebook in a new section I've been starting to think of as the things I need to understand before we move. Day 28 continued. Pete and Tyler spent the day working on the truck. My F-250 was already the better vehicle for what comes next. It's larger, more powerful, better suited to rough road. But what it needed for extended use in the current situation was modification. Pete's approach was methodical and specific. He started with the windows. The truck has standard glass. Standard glass is fine until it's not. He used 1/4-inch plywood from the barn's lumber supply and a construction staple gun to build interior panels for the rear side windows, not blocking the glass completely, but creating a second layer that would slow and stop any direct material contact from outside the vehicle. He left full visibility through the windshield and driver's side window, which were the navigating surfaces. The rear windows and the passenger side rear got the plywood. Then the bed. He built a basic frame in the truck bed using angle iron from Craig's Supply and stretched a combination of plywood and sheet metal across the top to create partial overhead cover for anyone riding in the bed. Not armor, cover. The distinction matters. It's meant to prevent falling debris and provide some concealment, not stop anything serious. Tyler added something I hadn't thought of. He'd seen a winch system in the Aldermere storage facility that hadn't been moved, and he knew we were going to need it. A front-mounted winch is the single most useful piece of vehicle recovery equipment in a situation where roads may be blocked by abandoned vehicles or debris. We went back to the storage facility, not the store, just the storage unit, and only Tyler and me, quickly, and pulled the winch and the necessary hardware and had it mounted to the truck's front bumper by evening. Pete doing the installation with Craig advising. The truck, by the end of day 28, looked like something someone had built for exactly this purpose, which, in a way, was what it was. Day 28 night. I had a conversation with Diane that I want to record because she said something I needed to hear. She's a biology teacher. She heard what Pat had described about the movement patterns, and she'd been thinking about it, and at around 9 p.m., she came and sat across from me at the radio station while I was running my evening monitoring. She said, "When I was teaching cellular biology, the unit I always found most interesting was about quorum sensing in bacterial colonies. Individual bacteria don't have complex behavior, but when they reach a certain population density, they start responding to the concentration of signaling molecules that other bacteria have produced. The colony shifts behavior at threshold density, not because any individual bacterium got smarter, because there are enough of them that the chemical signal finally reaches a concentration that triggers a response." I said, "You're saying the infected might be doing something like that?" She said, "I'm saying the configurations you've described, the clusters, the columns, the standing rows, start appearing when there are enough of them in an area. It's density dependent, and density dependent behavior isn't intelligence. It's chemistry. It's what bacteria do." She paused. "If the organism causing this has evolved or been designed with quorum sensing, if the infected individuals are emitting some kind of signal that, at high enough concentration, triggers collective positioning behavior, then the configurations aren't a surprise. They're predictable." I said, "They'd become more coordinated as numbers increase." She said, "In the sense that a bacterial bloom becomes more coordinated at high density. Yes. Not thinking, not planning, just responding to the chemical environment that enough of them together create. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "That's not more comforting than the alternative." She said, "I know, but understanding it correctly is better than understanding it wrong." That's Diane, 41 years old, biology teacher, 11 days in a grocery store back room, and she's sitting here doing epidemiological modeling because it's what she knows how to do, and because she's decided that doing useful things is how she manages the situation she's in. I made a note. If we find the military group, Diane is the person I most want them to talk to. Day 29, the transmission. I'm going to record this very carefully because it's the most significant piece of information I've received in 29 days, and I want every detail correct. At 4:17 a.m. on day 29, the government frequency I've been monitoring since day 11 gave a transmission unlike any previous one. Not a brief clear text gap before cipher. A full voice transmission, unencrypted, running for 4 minutes and 38 seconds. I was at the radio. I had the recorder running. I always have it running during monitoring, and I captured the full transmission. I've been transcribing it into the notebook, and I'm going to give the complete text of the relevant portions here, as accurately as I can. Male voice. The older, tired voice I'd heard briefly before. He said, "This is a general broadcast to any civilian receivers monitoring this frequency. I'm going off standard protocol for this transmission, because I believe the standard protocol has failed in its primary communication objective, and we have too little time for that to continue. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm coordinating the extraction phase of the Eastern Sector response, and the window for that phase closes in approximately 72 hours from the time of this transmission. After that window, the extraction point at Delta is no longer viable, for reasons I am not going to detail over open frequencies. If you are a survivor in the Eastern Sector, roughly the Tri-County area east of the primary urban center, and you are mobile, the extraction point at Delta is accessible via the State Forest Service road designations I'm going to give you now. The grid reference for Delta is, and he gave it, the same grid reference I'd decoded from the tone signal. He continued, "At Delta, there will be personnel and transport capacity for a specific number of survivors. I cannot tell you that number on this channel. I can tell you that we are not at capacity. There are things about this extraction that I am required by my orders to not specify. I am going to specify some of them anyway, because I think you deserve to know. This is not a rescue operation in the full sense of the word. This is a population preservation protocol. The people who arrive at Delta will be transported to a facility that is established, secure, and capable of long-term habitation. They will not be free to leave that facility in the immediate term. I don't know the long-term disposition. That's above my authority. The facility is approximately 300 miles from Delta. It's underground. It was built for this scenario. That's all I can say about it. What I can say, personally, is this. I've been a Federal Emergency Management Coordinator for 22 years. This is the scenario we prepared for, and never wanted to use the preparation. The people who are going to arrive at Delta deserve to know that what comes after it is organized and intended to be survivable. It's not a trap. It's a terrible option that is better than the alternatives currently available. 72 hours. Service Road Delta. Grid reference as given. I can't repeat this transmission. Good luck. And then silence. I sat at the radio for a long time. 72 hours from 4:17 a.m. on day 29. Put the window closing at approximately 4 a.m. on day 32. We're 200 miles from the grid reference. No, about 34 miles. I've been measuring against the topo maps since I first decoded the reference. 34 miles. On current roads, with current infected density, with 14 people and modified vehicles, it's an achievable distance in a single day of careful travel. It's achievable. It's also not certain. Nothing is certain. And the man on the radio said, they will not be free to leave that facility in the immediate term. I turned off the recorder. I sat in the dark with the hiss of the radio, and I thought about that sentence for a long time. Not free to leave. 300 miles underground. Population preservation protocol. Then I thought about the alternative, which is staying here while the rural classification threshold rises and the infected density increases, and the Aldermere group, now missing 8 people, looks for leverage. I thought about Dennis, about Janice's insulin situation, and how that trends in a resource-limited environment over a winter, about Abby, sleeping on the cot with the quality of someone who needed to sleep more than they'd been allowed to, about Ray's arm and what Diane's quorum sensing model means for a region where the infected population is growing. Then I thought about the transmission itself, the man who went off protocol to tell us the honest version of what we were heading toward. That's not a trap. A trap doesn't show you the door it's behind. The man was exhausted, and he went off script because he wanted people to make an informed choice. I can disagree with the arrangement he was offering and still respect the honesty of how he offered it. I went and woke up Craig at 5 a.m. Craig listened to the full playback on the recorder without interrupting. When it finished, he sat on the edge of his cot for a moment. Then he said, 72 hours. I said, yeah. He said, we need to tell everyone this morning. I said, yeah. He said, are you going to recommend we go? I thought about it. I said, I'm going to lay out what I know and let the group decide. Same as always. He looked at me for a second. He said, Owen, you have an opinion. Give them your opinion too. I said, yeah. I took a breath. We should go. He said, okay. He started getting dressed. Day 29. Full group meeting, 7 a.m. I played the transmission for everyone. All of them. Even Dennis. Because he was going to find out anyway, and because he'd been part of this group's information chain since day 10, when he sat down at the radio and told me what the tone signal sounded like. Nobody spoke during the playback. Abby, who I'd been watching from across the table, sat with her arms on the table and listened with the particular attention of someone who's been in a place where information was controlled and who now has access to the unfiltered version and knows what that's worth. When the transmission ended, I gave them my analysis, all the technical details, the grid reference, the distance, the route options I'd mapped using the topo maps and the road atlas, the estimated travel time, the infected density along the various approach options. I told them about the authorization window. I told them what I knew and what I didn't know about the facility. Then I said what Craig had asked me to say. I said, my opinion is that we go, not because I'm certain it's the right decision, because I think the cost of staying here through what's coming is higher than the cost of what this transmission describes, and because 34 miles in the modified truck, with the people and the equipment we have, is a manageable operation if we plan it properly. Long silence. Craig said, I'm going. Helen put her hand on Craig's arm. She said, we're going. Nora said, yes, just the one word. Pete looked at Tyler. Tyler shrugged and said, where else do I have to be? Pete said, yeah, okay. Walt, who was the newest substantial voice at the table and who'd been quiet through most of the planning, said, I'd like to know what happens if the facility is not what this man described. I said I didn't know. He said, but you're going anyway. I said yes. He said, all right. Diane said, I want to document everything I know and everything Pat knows about the infected behavioral patterns before we go, in case it's useful to whoever is at that facility. I said yes, absolutely. Spend as much time today on that as you need. Gary said, I'll drive the second vehicle. We hadn't finalized a second vehicle, he said. I was a bus driver for 17 years. Give me anything with 4 wheels and I'll get it there. The second guard, whose name I'd been calling in my head, the storage unit guy, his actual name was Len, I'd learned, said he'd like to come and would pull his weight getting there. I said yes. Janice listened to all of it and said nothing until everyone else had spoken. Then she said, Dennis, what do you think? And Dennis, who had been sitting with his radio notebook in front of him and who had been very still during the transmission playback, said, I think we should go. I think the person on the radio sounded like someone telling the truth. Janice looked at him for a second and then looked at me and said, that's good enough for me. 14 people, 1 9-year-old, 1 dog, 1 unknown situation with Ray. Going. Day 29, into day 30. Preparation. The rest of day 29 was the most organized 20 hours of activity I've seen since before day 1. I gave everyone a specific task and a specific timeline, and people executed without drama, which tells you everything about what 29 days of shared survival does to a group's ability to function. Food. Helen managed the pack-out. Everything that could be transported in reasonable space got sorted into priority tiers. Tier 1, the medical supplies, Janice's medications, and glucose supplies, the seed packets. Tier 2, dense caloric goods, the canned meats, the preserved items from the dairy farm root cellar, the dried beans and rice. Tier 3, convenience items that were worth taking if space allowed, left behind if not. She made the call on Tier 3 without asking for input, because she'd been making the food decisions for 29 days, and she knew the values better than anyone. Equipment. Craig and Pete went through the tools. What would be needed in transit and at arrival. Basic hand tools, the fuel cans, the winch hardware, the communication equipment. Everything got staged in the barn in organized groups. Communications. I spent several hours doing something specific to the radio setup that I want to detail. I can't take the full antenna infrastructure with me. It's built into the property. But I have a portable antenna I built over the years for exactly this kind of deployment. A collapsible VHF, UHF setup that can be erected in 30 minutes and will give me receive and transmit capability comparable to 60% of what I've been running here. I packed that and the full shortwave portable set and every charged battery in the shelter. The spectrum analyzer stays. It's hardwired to the property. The notebooks, both of them, full and dense with 29 days of data. Those come. Ray. I had a separate conversation with him. About the arm. About where he was. He said, "I'm coming. The arm is what it is." I said I knew. He said, "If it becomes a problem at wherever we're going." I said, "It won't be your problem alone. We'll deal with it together." He looked at me and said, "You were ready to open that gate on day 12. That's what I've been thinking about." I said, "You were standing there." He said, "Yeah," and he went back to the barn to pack. Abby spent part of the evening with Diane, who had found that the girl had an unusual level of biological knowledge for her age, and was apparently using her in the documentation project. I could hear them talking, Diane asking questions, and Abby answering, a kind of accidental mentorship that had assembled itself in 2 days. Diane told me afterward that Abby had been observing the infected in her neighborhood before she ended up at the store, and had made several specific observations about their behavior that Diane had not heard from anyone else. Things about sound threshold, the specific minimum volume that seemed to trigger orientation response. Things about lighting, whether darkness changed their behavior, things she'd noticed by watching carefully and keeping mental notes because she was a systematic thinker who'd needed something to do with her mind. I added her observations to the notebook. Bert spent the night in the shelter for the first time. He moved through the rooms, stopped with everyone briefly, then settled by the door. I think he understood something was different about this night, in the way dogs seem to understand shifts in their humans' collective state. Dennis came to me at 9 p.m. and said, "I want to be useful tomorrow." I said, "You've been useful every day." He said, "No, I mean really useful. I want to do something specific." I thought about it. I said, "You're going to be my second set of eyes for the route. You've been looking at these maps with me for weeks. You know the waypoints, you know the alternatives. When I'm driving, I need someone in the passenger seat who can read the map and call out the next turn before I need to know it. That's you." He said, "Okay." He went back to Janice. Day 30. We're leaving today. I started recording at 4 a.m. The radio had one more thing for me before we went. It wasn't from the government frequency. It was Radio Rita, the woman who'd been broadcasting from a high floor of a downtown office tower since day 1, giving calm, descriptive updates in a voice that sounded like she was doing a weather forecast instead of reporting the end of the world. She was still there, 29 days in that building, alone with her radio and her window view. She said, "This is my last broadcast from this location. I've been up here long enough. I've watched this city for 29 days, and I've tried to tell it honestly, and I don't think anyone's been listening for a while, but it felt important to keep doing it regardless. A pause. The streets are different today. Not more active, quieter. They're still down there, a lot of them. But they're all facing the same direction this morning, as far as I can see, which is roughly east, like they're all waiting for something east of here. Another pause. Longer. I don't know what that means. I'm going to stop thinking about what it means and start moving. I've got a fire exit and a parking garage on the east side of this building, where there are cars, and I'm going to try to get to one of those cars, and then I'm going to drive somewhere that isn't this. Her voice shifted slightly. Something warmer in it, though she kept it controlled. If anyone's been out there listening, thanks for the company. Good luck. Static. I sat there for a moment. I said, toward the radio, quietly, "Good luck, Rita." Then I turned it off. The shelter radio. For the first time in 29 days. 6 a.m. Loading. The truck had been packed and staged in the barn since midnight. Craig's truck, Gary's now, by election, had been prepped alongside it with the second priority pack of supplies and the 3 people who would ride in it. Gary driving, Len riding, Walt in the back seat, everyone else in my truck, which meant a full cab and a covered bed with Bert and most of the gear. The route I'd mapped, south on the county road for 1 mile to avoid the Route 9 infected corridor I'd mapped, east on a secondary road I'd confirmed as passable on the Day 16 dairy farm run, then northeast on a sequence of rural roads and one stretch of State Forest Service road that added distance but kept us off any of the identified infected movement channels, all the way to the final approach road for the extraction point. 34 miles. I'd estimated 4 to 6 hours given the conditions, with 2 contingency route options flagged on the map for the sections I was least certain about. The decision about the shelter was the one I'd been putting off. I'd spent 9 years and a significant portion of my life building what was under this property. The food in the storage rooms, the hydroponic bay with its first tomato plants finally setting fruit, the radio infrastructure, the water system, 2,000 gallons in the ground. I left it all running. The solar system will keep the batteries charged indefinitely. The hand pump well will stay accessible. The hydroponic system's automated lighting cycle will keep the plants alive for some time before they need attention. If somebody finds this property, somebody who needs it, who's in the trees at the fence line, who's alone and not turning when they should be, the gate is going to be unlocked. I left it unlocked deliberately, and I left a note in a sealed bag at the southeast fence post. The last thing I did before loading up. The note says what's here and how to use it. It has basic operating instructions for the shelter systems. It has the radio frequencies and what I know about the tone signal. It has the grid reference for the extraction point and the transmission, transcribed by hand, with the time of the authorization window and a note that if they're reading this after that window has closed, the grid reference might still be worth something, because an established facility is an established facility, regardless of the extraction timeline. It has one more thing at the bottom. Just this. If you're out there alone, and you're scared, and you don't know who's inside, come to the gate. We're the kind of people who open gates. I signed it. Owen Garrett. I put the date. Then I locked the barn. Then I unlocked the main gate and left it open. Then I got in the truck. 7:12 a.m. Moving. I want to record the first part of the drive because I think it matters to the record. We went south on the county road, my truck first, Gary's truck, about 50 yards behind. The morning was overcast, cold enough to see breath, the kind of flat gray October sky that doesn't give you shadows or definition, just light without source. The road was empty. Dennis was in the passenger seat, with the map folded to the first section. He called the turns before I needed them. Every single one. He'd been studying these routes for days and he knew them. He called them with a calmness that was striking in a 9-year-old boy who 6 hours ago had been reading by lamplight in a shelter while his grandmother watched him. Nora was behind me in the cab. She was quiet. She had her medical bag between her feet. Ray was in the truck bed with Bert and most of the gear. I'd been thinking about putting Ray in the cab because of the cold, but he'd wanted the bed. He said he could hear better from there. He said if anything was coming, he'd knock on the rear window. First thing of note, at about the 3-mile mark, on the secondary road heading east, there were infected on the shoulder. Not many, 4 or 5, moving loosely south. They responded to the truck, orienting toward us as we passed, but we were past them at speed before any of them had begun to move toward the road. In the rear view, I watched them turn and face where the truck had been, standing at the roadside, and then slowly drift south again. Second, about 8 miles in, Ray knocked on the rear window. I slowed immediately. He pointed right, south of us, through a gap in the trees. There was a group of infected in a field, a significant number, moving in a loose column heading east. They were maybe 300 yards from the road. The column was moving roughly parallel to our route, slower than us, and didn't react to the truck at that distance. I looked at the column for as long as I could while still driving. It was heading east, Diane's quorum sensing model. The cluster outside the city facing east, Radio Rita's last broadcast. They're all facing east this morning. Something east is generating a signal at a density or frequency that's pulling them in that direction. What's east is, among other things, the Appalachian foothills, the state forest, the extraction point at Delta. I didn't say this out loud in the truck. I said it in my head and drove. Dennis called the next turn. 14 miles in, we hit the first significant problem. A section of the secondary road was blocked by 2 vehicles that had been involved in what looked like a collision in the first days of the outbreak. An SUV and a panel van, angled across both lanes. Not quite a full blockage, but close enough that I couldn't get the truck through the gap without risk of getting stuck. I got out and assessed. The van was on a slope and was mobile, potentially. Pete jumped out and assessed the van situation with me. Craig came up and looked. Pete said, "Van's not in park. If we can get it rolling, we can push it off the slope." Craig said, "We've got the winch." 3 minutes later, the winch cable was connected to the van's tow hook. It had one, a commercial van with a tow hook, which was lucky. And I ran the winch from the cab, and the van moved off the slope and cleared enough of the road that both trucks could pass. 6 minutes total. We kept moving. Mile 22, the most significant moment of the drive. We were on the State Forest Service road by this point. Single lane, tree covered on both sides. An empty road I hadn't been on before, but that matched the topo map exactly. The trees were tall enough on either side to create a kind of tunnel effect, the canopy overhead with its October-stripped branches, making a lattice that the gray sky showed through. Ray knocked on the window again. Hard this time. 3 knocks. Rapid. I stopped. He came around to my window. His face was focused, not frightened, something more than alert. He said, quietly, "There's something ahead, a lot of something. I can hear them." He pointed up the road, past a curve about a 1/4 mile ahead, maybe half a mile past that curve. "They're not moving." Not moving, the same configuration I'd seen in the industrial district. I looked at the map. There was no alternative route from this point that didn't add 20 miles minimum and take us close to a town that I'd flagged as a high-density risk. The service road was the right path. The question was what was on it. I said, "How many?" Ray said, "More than I've heard before." He paused. He looked at his arm without looking like he was trying to. "A lot." I sat in the truck and thought about it. The radio, the extraction, the window closing in about 46 hours. 300 feet of service road between me and whatever was past that curve, and 20 miles of detour if I turned around. Nora said, from behind me in the cab, "We've been quiet so far. If we stay quiet going past." Dennis said, "What if they're not responding to sound?" He said it carefully, like he'd been thinking about it and wasn't sure it was the right thing to say. I looked at him. He said, "What if they're facing east, and they're not reacting to sound anymore? They're just going east. If they're in quorum." He'd been listening to Diane and Pat. He'd absorbed it. He said, "If they're in that state, they might not care about the truck at all." Diane, from the back seat, said quietly, "That's a reasonable hypothesis." She didn't say it was certain. She said it was reasonable. I thought about the column in the field at mile 8, moving east, not reacting to the truck at 300 yards. I said, "We go slow, windows up, no talking. If they react, we go back and find another way. If they don't." I left the sentence there. I drove at walking speed around the curve. What was on the other side of that curve? A crowd, a large crowd of infected, on and off the road, extending back into the trees on both sides. More than I could count in a quick scan. Hundreds, possibly, all oriented east, all standing still or moving very slowly in one direction. The road ran through the edge of the crowd. The service road was where the trees thinned, and some of them had drifted onto the road surface, standing on the asphalt facing east, with the same vacant forward orientation as everything I'd ever seen. I drove into it at walking pace. It's hard to describe what the next 4 minutes felt like. The infected were on both sides of the truck, some of them within arm's reach of the vehicle. They were making the tonal sound, all of them together, a low ambient frequency that came through the closed windows, and through the glass, and into the cab, like something you feel in your chest, more than hear, with your ears. They were not reacting to the truck. None of them turned, none of them oriented. They just stood and moved east, slowly, in the mass. Dennis sat in the passenger seat with the map on his lap and his other hand flat on the dashboard, and he didn't move and didn't speak, and he watched through the windshield with a kind of focused stillness that I've been trying for 30 days to sustain in myself, and that he managed naturally, without apparent effort. The crowd thinned at about the half-mile mark. Then there was open road ahead. I increased speed gradually. In the rear view, Gary's truck came through behind us, equally slow, equally intact. Nobody said anything for about a mile. Then Nora said, "We drove through that?" Not a question, just noting it. I said, "Yeah." She said, "Okay," and looked back at the map. Mile 31. We found the State Forest Service road junction that the grid reference indicated. A brown service road sign, standard issue, weathered. The junction was clear. I turned north. The road climbed. The foothills began. The trees got taller and more dense, and the sky between the branches looked cleaner, somehow, clearer. I don't know if that's actually true, or if it's what I wanted to see. Mile 34, the flat valley, the topo map showed. We came around a final curve, and the trees opened, and there was a broad, flat area bordered by a river to the north, and in the flat area were structures. Not buildings, modular units, trailers, tents, a few permanent-looking small structures that had been here before whatever was set up around them. There was a fence, a proper one, chain link with razor wire, different from mine, but built with similar intent. There were lights, generator-powered lights running at a perimeter that was staffed. I could see people at the corners from a quarter-mile out. And in the center of the flat area, on the grass, there were other vehicles. Trucks, a few buses, one large military-style transport, and small figures moving between them. I stopped the truck at the edge of the road where it met the valley, and I sat for a moment. Ray knocked softly on the rear window. When I lowered it, he was looking at the valley below with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, which was something that wasn't quite relief. He said, "Something in there sounds right." He looked at his arm, then at me. He said, "Is that strange to say?" I said no. Dennis said, "There are kids down there." He was looking through the windshield with his hand up, shading his eyes against the flat gray sky. He said, "I can see kids." He turned to me. "That means families got through." He looked like he'd just been given something he'd been keeping himself from hoping for. I started the truck again and we drove down into the valley. What happened at the gate? There was a checkpoint. Two people in military-style clothing without insignia who looked at both vehicles, took names, asked basic health questions, and asked, specifically, about medical training, engineering background, and communications capability, in that order. Like those were the things that mattered first. I told them about Nora. I told them about myself. I told them about Pat and Diane, and what was in the notebooks. The man at the gate, young, under 30, looked like he'd been at this checkpoint for a long time without sleep. Wrote everything down in a physical notebook with the same kind of systematic attention I'd been using for 30 days. And he said, "Come through." He said one more thing before I drove in. He said, "The coordinator who made that broadcast this morning, he's inside. He wanted me to tell anyone who came in because of it that the offer stands exactly as stated. No more, no less. You can talk to him directly if you want." I said I'd want to do that. He nodded and waved us through. Inside the fence, people. More than I'd expected. 100, maybe more, in varying states of organization and calm. Some were settled, had been here for days. Some had arrived just ahead of us, and were still in the early processing stage, standing with their things and their families, and looking around with the particular expression of people who have been moving fast for too long, and have just stopped. We parked, got out, 14 people and a dog and a 9-year-old boy who had called every turn correctly. Janice got out of the truck and stood in the valley air for a moment with her face up to the overcast sky and her eyes closed. Dennis got out and stood next to her and said something to her quietly that I couldn't hear. She put her arm around him. Ray stayed by the truck for a minute, one hand resting on the door, looking at the mountains on the east side of the valley. His arm, the bitten one, was in his jacket sleeve. After a moment he took the jacket off, just took it off, in the cold, and he held the arm up and looked at the discolored section of skin in the flat light. He stood there for about 20 seconds. Then he put the jacket back on and looked at me and said, "I want to talk to whoever's running the medical operation here." I said, "Let's find them." Nora already had her bag on her shoulder and was talking to a woman in medical gear who'd come to meet the vehicles. Even from 30 feet I could see Nora falling into report mode, the calm professional handoff of status information in the right order. The posture that says, "I know what I'm doing and here's what I've got." The other woman was listening with attention. They were going to work together. That was clear in 10 seconds. Pete and Tyler were standing by Craig's truck, looking around the facility, not talking. After a while, Pete said something, and Tyler said something back, and they both did the short exhale, that means almost a laugh. Craig was looking at the fence. He was assessing it, the way he assessed every fence he encountered, with a professional eye and an already forming list of improvements. He caught me looking and shrugged. He said, "The east corner post needs reinforcement." I said, "Tell them." Helen had found the food distribution area and was already in a conversation with the person running it, and from the body language of both of them, I could tell that Helen was already taking notes, and the other person was already relieved that someone was taking notes. I stood in the middle of all of it and looked around. 30 days. I'd built a shelter for one person and spent 30 days finding out what it was actually for. Not for one person surviving alone, clean and prepared and isolated. For a gate that opened. For a radio call at 4 a.m. For the particular thing that happens when you put a paramedic and a retired mail carrier and a bus driver and a biology teacher and a 16-year-old girl who'd been watching infected in her neighborhood and keeping mental notes in the same enclosed space, and give them enough days and enough pressure for them to start being useful to each other in ways nobody planned. I'd built something, and then something larger had built itself out of what I'd built. I needed to find the coordinator. The man with the tired voice who'd gone off protocol because he thought people deserved the honest version. I had questions that the notebooks couldn't answer. About the facility 300 miles from here. About the infected columns moving east. About what Diane's quorum sensing model meant for what came after this valley. About what Ray was, specifically, in a world where whatever caused this could leave a person bitten and not fully turned, and with ears that heard diesel engines at a mile, and arms that felt warm in the dark. I needed those answers, or at least the honest version of how much they knew and how much they didn't. That was the next thing. But for right now, I was standing in a valley in the October mountains, and 14 people who'd come through 30 days of things that should have stopped them were not stopped. And Dennis was running, actually running, across the grass toward 2 other kids he'd spotted at the far side of the camp. And Bert was beside me, with his nose up reading the air in all directions, and Janice was watching Dennis run with a specific expression on her face that I recognized. That expression is, "I thought I might not get to see this." She got to see it. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and found the recorder. I turned it on and said, "Into it," quietly enough that only the recorder could catch it. Day 30. We made it to the valley. All 14 of us. 1 dog. The window's still open and we're through it, and whatever comes next comes next. I paused. I built a shelter for one person alone. That was the wrong plan. and the right materials. Now I'm going to go find out what comes after the shelter. I clicked it off. Somewhere on the east side of the mountains, the columns were moving. The tone signal was still running. I knew this because the portable radio in my bag picked it up even here, even inside the fence. A steady, repeating pattern that Diane was probably already going to want to analyze with whoever was running this facility's communications. The infected were orienting east, in numbers and configurations that didn't fit the simple model, following something none of us fully understood yet, into the foothills of these mountains. And somewhere in that valley, a 9-year-old boy with a notebook full of radio observations was meeting other kids for the first time in 30 days. And Bert sat down next to me and looked east with his ears forward. And the gray sky above the mountains had a particular quality to it that I couldn't name. Not hope exactly. More specific than hope. More like the next problem. There was always a next problem. That was the one constant I'd learned in 30 days of building this group, building whatever it was we were now. I zipped my jacket and went to find the coordinator. The notebook stayed in my pocket. The recorder too.